In every dictatorship, there is a man who thrives not on fame or power or ideology, but on secrets. Heinrich Müller was that man. Most people know Himmler, Goering, or Heydrich. Müller operated in the shadows behind them, unseen, unheard, and untouched by public attention. He commanded fear without ever raising his voice. He destroyed enemies without ever stepping onto a battlefield. And when the Third Reich collapsed in fire and rubble, when generals surrendered and ministers killed themselves, Müller did something none of them managed to do. He vanished. No grave, no trial, no trace. A man whose entire life was built on surveillance and pursuit simply evaporated into the smoke of a dying regime. To this day, historians, intelligence agencies, and investigators are still chasing the ghost of Heinrich Müller. Müller did not come from aristocracy. He did not have the polished background of an officer or the ideological fury of early party radicals. He was a policeman, a career investigator, a man who lived by case files, cross-examinations, and order. In the years before the Nazis rose to power, Müller earned a reputation in the Munich police force for being relentless. He tracked suspects with a patience that bordered on obsession. Criminals feared him. Colleagues admired him. He learned how to listen more than he spoke, how to take in every detail, how to make silence uncomfortable. These skills analysis, persistence, emotional detachment should have made him a great detective. Instead, they made him the perfect architect for terror. When Hitler seized power, Müller joined the secret state police, the Gestapo. He did not join out of belief. He joined because he understood power. The new regime did not just want loyalty, it wanted efficiency. Müller offered them both. He rose quickly, bypassing men with stronger ideology and louder voices. Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich noticed him. They needed a man who could build a machine of repression. They needed someone who saw people not as lives, but as records to be processed. Müller took over the Gestapo and turned it into a machine. He created a system where fear replaced loyalty, where neighbours informed on neighbours, where any person, regardless of guilt, could disappear. A knock on the door in the night, a file created, a signature, and someone was gone. Under Müller, the Gestapo reached into every home, every corner of daily life. A joke in a cafe could lead to interrogation. A careless word in a factory could lead to arrest. Müller believed that the best form of control was uncertainty. When people no longer knew what was safe to say, they stopped speaking at all. Unlike Himmler, who cloaked cruelty in ideology, Müller took pride in being professional. He once said, "I have no conscience. It will be my conscience that will keep me from misusing my authority." A chilling paradox that a man without conscience believed conscience would protect him. When the war expanded and the regime shifted from repression to extermination, Müller became a key communicator between the Gestapo, the SS, and the agencies organising deportations. He did not swing the rifle. He did not open the gas valves. He scheduled trains. He tracked quotas. He followed up on efficiency irregularities. He demanded reports detailing how many were deported, how many were killed, how many escaped. He turned genocide into paperwork. At the famous Wannsee conference, where the final solution was coordinated, Müller was not in the spotlight, but his fingerprints were in the documents. He assigned officers to attend, ensured the minutes were accurate, and distributed follow-up memos that operationalized mass murder. Behind every file that ended a life, Müller's initials appeared like a shadow. By 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on Berlin and the bunker swallowed itself in desperation, Müller remained loyal to the regime, not out of belief, but because loyalty to power was his nature. Others panicked. Müller stayed calm. He reportedly told an associate that he would never be captured alive because he knew too many secrets of too many governments. Then, sometime in the last days of the war, he vanished. Witnesses saw him in Berlin shortly before the final collapse, still working, still wearing his uniform, still issuing orders. After that, nothing. No body was ever found, no verified grave. Allied intelligence searched for him for years. They interrogated former agents, they examined corpses, they chased rumours across Europe and South America, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay. Nothing. Not a fingerprint, not a signature, not a trace. The greatest hunter of the Nazi regime became the world's most successful fugitive. Was he killed in the ruins of Berlin? Did another intelligence agency recruit him because he was too valuable to prosecute? Did he escape across borders with the same false identities he once used against his enemies? No one knows. And perhaps that is the cruelest part of his legacy. The man who meticulously recorded the fate of millions left no record of his own. Tonight, we step into that darkness, into the interrogation rooms where fear replaced law, into the offices where decisions were typed instead of spoken, into the final days of the bunker when the hunter slipped into the shadows. This is the entire history of Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo, master of secrets, and the man who disappeared from the face of the earth. Before we begin, pause for a moment, not to think about him, but to think about you. Where are you right now as you listen? Are you stretched out under blankets, letting the world finally slow down for the night? Or are you sitting somewhere quiet, using this story as an escape from everything, waiting for you tomorrow? And what time is it where you are? Is the sun gone? Or has the day just begun? I like imagining these stories, traveling across oceans and time zones, landing in your life at just the moment you need the silence. And if these long, slow journeys through history help you relax, think, or drift towards sleep, consider subscribing. It shows me that someone out there values deep storytelling, and it keeps me inspired to return with the next chapter. May 2nd, 1945, Berlin. The city burns in a silence more terrifying than the shelling that preceded it. Soviet soldiers pick through mountains of rubble on Prinz Albrecht Strasse, their boots crunching over glass and bone, searching for something more valuable than gold. They have orders from the very top, from Lavrenti Beria himself, the head of the NKVD. Find Heinrich Müller, the man who ran the Gestapo, who knew every secret of the Nazi terror apparatus, who signed tens of thousands of death warrants with the same indifference a clerk stamps invoices. But the offices that once housed the most feared organization in Europe are empty shells. The files are scattered like autumn leaves, burned pages dancing in the wind, and Heinrich Müller has vanished as completely as smoke. Lieutenant Pavel Ivanov, 26 years old, stands in what remains of Müller's personal office on the 3rd floor. 3 walls still stand, the 4th open to the sky like a dollhouse. Ivanov speaks fluent German, studied history at Moscow University before the war, and he understands what he's looking for. This isn't just about capturing another Nazi criminal. Müller commanded the entire Gestapo intelligence network, knew the identity of every Allied spy who'd been caught and possibly turned, understood the structure of Western intelligence services better than most Western intelligence officers. If the Soviets can find him, interrogate him, turn him, the intelligence value would be incalculable. But Müller's desk drawers hang open, empty. The safe behind the false panel in the wall already, known to Soviet intelligence from documents captured earlier, stands open. Its contents removed with deliberate care. Someone cleaned this office, and they did it methodically, choosing what to save and what to burn. By June, the Allied intelligence officers arrive to conduct their own search, and they discover what the Soviets already know. Heinrich Müller has performed the perfect disappearance. The Counterintelligence Corps assigns a team of 12 investigators to track him down. They interview Müller's secretary, his chauffeur, his immediate subordinates, anyone who might have seen him in those final days. The last confirmed sighting places him in the Führer bunker complex on April 29th, around 10 in the evening. He wore civilian clothes under his SS uniform, an unusual detail that multiple witnesses remember. He told the duty officer he was going to check the defensive positions. He never returned to his office. No one saw him die. No one saw him escape. He simply walked into the chaos of Berlin's final collapse and ceased to exist. The investigators moved to Müller's family apartment in the Charlottenburg district, damaged but standing. His wife, Sophie Müller, sits across from American interrogators with her 4 children huddled in the next room. She is 42 years old, tired beyond measure, and her story never changes across a dozen interviews with different agencies. Heinrich visited briefly on April 20th, Hitler's birthday. to check on the family. He seemed preoccupied but calm, gave no indication of farewell, made no arrangements for their safety or future. He left, and she never saw him again. The Americans searched the apartment thoroughly, looking for hidden documents, escape plans, addresses of safe houses. They find nothing. Sophie has no access to bank accounts, no hidden jewellery, no emergency funds. If her husband planned an escape, he did not include his family in those plans. The children's testimony matches their mother's. Their father vanished, and they seem genuinely abandoned. 1948 brings the first of what will become hundreds of reported sightings. Müller is seen in Munich, in Argentina, in Soviet-occupied East Germany, in Switzerland, in Spain. Each report demands investigation. Each investigation produces nothing concrete. Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter, devotes considerable resources to tracking Müller throughout the 1950s. He considers the Gestapo chief as dangerous as Eichmann, perhaps more so given his intelligence background. But the trail remains cold. Unlike other fleeing Nazis who maintain some contact with family, use known escape routes, or eventually surface in South American German communities, Müller leaves no trace. It's as if he understood how Nazi hunters operate and deliberately avoided every mistake his colleagues made. 1963 arrives with a new development that seems promising. Adolf Eichmann has been captured in Argentina, tried in Jerusalem, and executed. The trial brings renewed attention to other missing Nazi criminals. Prosecutors preparing cases against Holocaust perpetrators notice something remarkable and disturbing. Virtually every other senior official from the Reich Security Main Office has been accounted for. Reinhard Heydrich, Müller's superior, was assassinated in 1942. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who replaced Heydrich, was hanged at Nuremberg. Heinrich Himmler committed suicide in British custody. Adolf Eichmann captured and executed. Even lower-ranking officials have been found, tried, or confirmed dead. Only Heinrich Müller, who signed more deportation orders than anyone except possibly Eichmann himself, remains unaccounted for. His absence from the historical record becomes increasingly anomalous. The same year, West German investigators follow up on a curious lead. A grave in a Jewish cemetery in Berlin bears the name Heinrich Müller, born 1900. The Fullerman. Birth year is wrong. The Gestapo chief was born in 1900, but this grave lists the death year as 1945, which would be correct if he died in Berlin's final days. The coincidence seems too significant to ignore. Prosecutors obtain permission to exhume the grave. The remains are examined by forensic experts using 1960s technology skull measurements, bone analysis, dental records when available. The results are inconclusive and contradictory. The skull suggests a man in his 40s, but Müller would have been 63 in 1945. The height estimation doesn't quite match Müller's known dimensions. But forensic science in 1963 has limitations, and war graves often contain misidentified remains. The investigation concludes nothing definitive and quietly shelves the case. Decades pass, and the mystery deepens rather than resolves. The Cold War ends, Soviet archives open to researchers in 1991, and historians rush to examine NKVD files about Nazi war criminals. They find extensive documentation about the search for Heinrich Müller. Beria's personal interest is confirmed through multiple memos. The NKVD devoted substantial resources to finding the Gestapo chief, understanding his intelligence value, but the Soviet files contain the same frustrating endpoint. Last seen April 29th, 1945. Whereabouts unknown. More intriguingly, certain sections of the Müller files remain classified even after the Soviet Union's collapse. Russian authorities redact portions of documents from the immediate post-war period, claiming national security concerns. What could possibly require secrecy about a Nazi war criminal 70 years after his disappearance? The question haunts researchers, suggesting possibilities that official histories prefer to leave unexamined. 2013 brings modern technology to the old mystery. Berlin authorities, prompted by renewed public interest and improved DNA testing capabilities, decide to definitively solve the grave question. They exhume the remains from the 1945 burial site marked with Heinrich Müller's name. Forensic geneticists extract DNA from the bones and compare it to samples provided by confirmed Müller family descendants. The results are unambiguous. The body in the grave is not Heinrich Müller. It's not even close. The remains likely belong to a cemetery worker or local civilian killed during the final battle for Berlin, buried hastily and marked with a name that may have been coincidental or deliberately misleading. The definitive exclusion should provide clarity, but instead, it deepens the enigma. If Müller died in Berlin, where is his body? If he escaped, how did someone so documented vanish so completely? And why, after 80 years, do we still not know? The mystery of Heinrich Müller represents something more profound than a single missing person case. This was the Praeses, chief of the Gestapo, the man who coordinated the persecution of millions, who ran the most sophisticated police state in modern history. His signature appears on over 70,000 documents in archives around the world: deportation orders, execution authorizations, intelligence directives, interrogation reports. We have his handwriting, his bureaucratic style, his methodical approach to industrialized murder. We know what he did, we know how he thought, we know the machinery he controlled, but we don't know what happened to him in those final hours when his world collapsed. He was one of the most documented men in Nazi Germany, yet he achieved the most complete disappearance. The Phantom of Berlin remains a ghost, and his vanishing poses questions about justice, accountability, and the nature of historical memory that 80 years have failed to answer. How does a man like Heinrich Müller simply cease to exist? April 28th, 1899, Munich, Bavaria. Heinrich Müller enters the world in a two-room apartment above a bakery in the working-class district of Munich. His father, also named Heinrich, serves as a rural police official in the Bavarian countryside, one of thousands of minor functionaries who maintain order in the conservative Catholic kingdom. The family is poor but respectable, the kind of stolid, unremarkable people who form the backbone of any society. Young Heinrich, called Heine by his mother, is the second of 4 children. He attends Catholic school, serves as an altar boy, learns his catechism, and shows no particular distinction in any direction. Teachers describe him as quiet, diligent, unmemorable. He has brown hair, average height, a face that would blend into any crowd. Even as a child, Heinrich Müller possesses the quality that will define his entire career. He is perfectly, usefully ordinary. 1917 arrives, and with it the Great War's appetite for young men. Müller, 18 years old and working as a clerk in a factory, receives his conscription notice. He reports to the Bavarian Army Aviation Corps, not as a pilot, which requires education and social standing he lacks, but as an observer and gunner. The role suits him. He follows orders precisely, maintains equipment meticulously, never complains, never stands out. His superiors note his reliability and his strange ability to remain calm under fire. While other observers panic during dogfights or break under the stress of daily missions, Müller simply does his job. He receives the Iron Cross Second Class, a common decoration, and then something much rarer, the Iron Cross First Class, typically reserved for officers or men who demonstrate exceptional courage. Müller earns it not through dramatic heroism but through consistent competence: 97 missions flown, perfect attendance, 0 disciplinary problems. He returns to Munich in 1918 with decorations that suggest a capable soldier and nothing more. But Munich in 1918 and 1919 becomes a crucible that will shape Heinrich Müller's understanding of power, order, and the consequences of chaos. The Kaiser abdicates, the war ends in humiliating defeat, and Bavaria descends into revolutionary violence. Left-wing groups, inspired by the Bolshevik success in Russia, attempt to establish a Soviet Republic in Munich. The Bavarian Soviet Republic lasts barely 3 weeks, but those 3 weeks involve street battles, political murders, hostage-takings, and the complete breakdown of normal authority. Müller, back in Munich, and unemployed like millions of other veterans, watches his orderly world collapse into ideological warfare. The Freikorps, right-wing paramilitary units composed of bitter veterans, crushes the communist uprising with extreme violence. Müller joins them not out of political conviction but because they represent the restoration of order. He participates in house-to-house fighting, the brutal suppression of resistance, the summary executions that follow. Later investigations will find his name on rosters, but witnesses can barely remember him. Even amid violence, he remains unmemorable. The Bavarian government, traumatized by the near success of the communist takeover, dramatically expands its political police apparatus. They need men who understand the communist threat, who can identify agitators before they act, who will do whatever necessary to prevent another revolution. Heinrich Müller, decorated veteran with Freikorps experience, applies to the Munich police in 1919. He's accepted immediately and assigned to the political department, the unit responsible for monitoring extremist groups. He discovers his calling. Müller has a photographic memory, a quality that seems almost supernatural to his colleagues. He can read a Communist Party membership list once and recall every name weeks later. He remembers faces, addresses, organizational connections, patterns of behavior. He builds files, cross-references information, creates networks of informants. Within 2 years, Müller's files on communist activity in Bavaria are the most comprehensive in Germany. He knows every cell, every leader, every meeting place. The communists fear him because he's invisible until the moment of arrest, and then he knows everything. 19, 22, and 23 bring a new target to Müller's attention. A failed artist and Great War veteran named Adolf Hitler leads a small extremist party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. They're violent nationalists, vocally opposed to the Weimar Republic. In November 1923, Hitler and his followers attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government in what becomes known as the Beer Hall Putsch. The coup fails within hours, and the police easily suppress it. Detective Heinrich Müller participates in the investigation, interviewing participants, building files on the Nazi leadership. He creates dossiers on Hitler, on Heinrich Himmler, then a minor participant, on Hermann Göring, seriously wounded in the fighting. Müller's reports are thorough and damning. He identifies the Nazis as dangerous criminals, recommends continued surveillance, catalogues their organizational structure. His files go into storage, where they will remain buried throughout the 1930s, a potential embarrassment when the men Müller investigated become his superiors. The 1920s and early 30s see Müller rise steadily through the ranks of Bavaria's political police. He specializes in what the Germans call Subversionsbekämpfung, fighting subversion. His primary targets remain communists, social democrats, trade union organizers, anyone who threatens the conservative order. Müller develops his distinctive methodology during these years. He doesn't rush to arrest suspects. Instead, he watches them for months, mapping their entire network, identifying every connection, waiting until he understands the complete organizational structure. Then he strikes simultaneously at every point in the network, rolling up entire cells in coordinated raids. Communists in Bavaria learn that if Müller is investigating them, they're already compromised. His files are legendary for their completeness. One dossier runs to 300 pages on a single communist organizer, documenting every meeting attended, every contact made, every piece of mail sent over a 5-year period. Müller never forgets, never stops watching, never shows emotion. He's a machine that processes information and produces arrests. 1933 arrives and changes everything. Hitler becomes chancellor, the Nazis seize power, and suddenly the men Müller once investigated become the government. Heinrich Himmler, who Müller filed as a dangerous extremist in 1923, becomes police chief of Munich. Himmler's protege, Reinhard Heydrich, aristocratic, brilliant, and ruthless, begins building a new kind of police state. They review the political police personnel, looking for competent officers who can serve the new regime. They find Heinrich Müller's files, his arrest statistics, his methodologies. They also find his old reports on Nazi activities from 1923, which recommend treating the party as a criminal organization. For most officers, this would mean immediate dismissal or worse. But Heydrich reads Müller's reports more carefully and recognizes something valuable. Müller investigated Nazis with exactly the same thoroughness he investigated communists. He wasn't politically motivated. He was simply efficient at suppressing whatever groups his superiors designated as enemies. Heydrich understands he's found the perfect instrument. The first meeting between Reinhard Heydrich and Heinrich Müller occurs sometime in 1934, though no precise record survives. Contemporary accounts describe the encounter as revealing. Heydrich, tall and blonde, cultivated and charming when he chooses, represents the Nazi ideal, what they call Aryan superiority made flesh. Müller, average height and build, Catholic and working class, entirely lacking in ideological enthusiasm, represents the opposite. But Heydrich doesn't need another true believer. He needs someone who can transform terror from spontaneous violence into systematic policy. He needs someone apolitical enough to serve any ideology, intelligent enough to build surveillance systems, and ruthless enough to implement them without moral hesitation. Müller possesses all these qualities. Heydrich promotes him. By 1936, Müller heads the Gestapo's executive department. By 1939, when Heydrich consolidates all police and security services into the Reich Security Main Office, Müller commands Amt IV, the Gestapo itself. The transformation of Heinrich Müller from Bavarian detective to chief of the Gestapo reveals something disturbing about how terror states recruit their servants. The Nazis didn't create Müller. They found him already formed by Weimar-era police work and gave him unlimited scope for his particular talents. He never joined the Nazi Party voluntarily, waiting until 1939 when membership became mandatory for his position. His party number, 4,583,199, shows how late and reluctantly he joined. True believers resented him, questioning his loyalty, whispering about his past investigations of Nazi activities. But Müller didn't need ideology. He had something more useful. Absolute loyalty to whoever held power, combined with the technical competence to make their desires reality. Himmler wanted the Communist Party destroyed, Müller destroyed it. Heydrich wanted spy networks penetrated, Müller penetrated them. Hitler wanted Jews deported and murdered, Müller signed the orders. The policeman's apprentice, raised to maintain order in Bavaria, had become the perfect bureaucrat of terror, efficient, thorough, emotionless, and completely without conscience or limiting principles. The question that will haunt historians is whether men like Müller are created by systems like Nazism, or whether such men exist in every society, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal their nature. March 19th, 1934, Munich. Reinhard Heydrich walks through the corridors of Bavarian police headquarters, carrying a leather portfolio containing personnel files. He's 30 years old, recently appointed by Heinrich Himmler to reorganize Bavaria's political police, and he approaches the task with the systematic intensity that defines everything he does. Heydrich is the son of an opera composer, a former naval officer dismissed for scandalous behaviour, and now the rising star of the SS intelligence service. He's brilliant, cultured, speaks perfect English and French, plays violin beautifully, and possesses absolutely no moral limitations. Himmler chose him precisely because Heydrich combines aristocratic bearing with complete ruthlessness. Now, Heydrich needs subordinates who can implement his vision of a new kind of police state, one based not on random violence but on comprehensive surveillance, patient intelligence work, and bureaucratic precision. He opens the file on Heinrich Müller and begins to read. The file impresses him immediately. Müller's arrest statistics are exceptional. Hundreds of communists detained, networks dismantled, almost no acquittals when cases reach trial. His surveillance methodologies are sophisticated, showing understanding of organizational structures and how to penetrate them. The interrogation reports demonstrate patience and psychological insight. But what really captures Heydrich's attention is Müller's complete lack of political colouring. Most police reports from this period include ideological commentary, officers inserting their own political views into supposedly objective documents. Müller's reports contain only facts, names, dates, addresses, organisational charts, evidence. He investigated Nazis in 1923 with the same dispassionate thoroughness he later applied to communists. The man appears to have no politics whatsoever, only methodology. Heydrich recognises immediately that such political neutrality is extraordinarily valuable. Ideologues can be useful, but they're also unpredictable, prone to disputes about doctrine and interpretation. A technician who serves the organisation rather than an ideology will be far more reliable. The interview happens in Heydrich's office, Spartan and cold despite Munich's spring warmth. Müller arrives precisely on time, uniform correct, posture military but not stiff. Heydrich studies him medium height, brown hair already receding, forgettable face. If you pass this man on the street an hour later, you might not remember seeing him. Heydrich begins with the obvious question. The 1923 reports recommending surveillance of the Nazi Party. Müller's response is characteristically direct. Those were his orders at the time. The Nazis had attempted to overthrow the legal government. He investigated them as he would investigate any group engaged in illegal political violence. His personal opinions, if any, were irrelevant to the professional task. Heydrich almost smiles. This is exactly what he hoped to hear. Müller isn't apologizing, isn't claiming he secretly sympathized with the Nazis all along. He's stating that he investigated enemies of the state, and the definition of enemies changes depending on who controls the state. It's a bureaucrat's answer, and it's perfect. Heydrich promotes Müller immediately and begins incorporating him into the expanding apparatus of Nazi terror. The structure Heydrich is building will eventually become the Reich Security Main Office RSHA, which merges the party's SD intelligence service with the state's Gestapo, secret police, and Kripo criminal police. It's an unprecedented consolidation, putting party and state security under a single command, and it requires personnel who can work across institutional boundaries without ideological friction. Müller becomes head of the Gestapo's executive department, which means he coordinates actual operations, arrests, interrogations, surveillance, while other departments handle policy and analysis. The division of labour suits both men. Heydrich makes strategy, Müller implements it. Heydrich writes the orders, Müller ensures they're carried out. The partnership works because neither man has illusions about the other. Heydrich knows Müller isn't a Nazi and doesn't care. Müller knows Heydrich will sacrifice anyone for personal advancement and serves him anyway. The Night of the Long Knives in June 1934 demonstrates Müller's value to the regime. Ernst Röhm, head of the SA stormtroopers, has become a threat to Hitler's consolidation of power. The SA's millions of street fighters want a genuine socialist revolution, which would alienate the army and industrialists Hitler needs. Hitler decides to eliminate the SA leadership in a sudden purge. Heydrich coordinates the operation, and Müller handles the detailed execution. Over 2 days, SS and Gestapo units arrest and execute approximately 85 people, SA leaders, political enemies, old scores settled. Müller's files on the SA, maintained for years, provide the arrest lists and locations. His interrogation teams process the detained men with industrial efficiency. The transcripts that survive show Müller's methodology: patient questioning, building detailed confessions, documenting everything even though the outcome execution is already determined. The Night of the Long Knives isn't justice. It's murder, disguised as legal process. But Müller treats it like any other police operation, and the documentation proves invaluable for Hitler's post-facto justification. By 1936, Müller has transformed interrogation from an art into a science. Traditional police interrogation relied on fear, violence, and the interrogator's intuition. Müller systematizes it. He develops written protocols for different types of suspects. He trains interrogators in psychological manipulation techniques. He establishes the practice of marathon sessions, 12, 15, 20 hours without break, using exhaustion as a weapon more effective than beating. He insists on detailed documentation of every session, creating transcripts that can be analysed for inconsistencies and used to construct additional lines of questioning. The Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse gains its terrible reputation during these years, and Müller's methodologies are a significant reason why. Suspects emerge broken not from random torture, but from systematic psychological destruction. Resistance members learn that the Gestapo doesn't just want information. They want complete confessions, detailed organisational charts, every contact and connection. And they have the patience and methods to extract it. The Spanish Civil War, which erupts in 1936, provides Müller with an international stage for his growing expertise. Germany supports Franco's nationalists, and the Gestapo establishes liaison with Spanish security services. Müller coordinates intelligence sharing and helps train Spanish police in surveillance and interrogation techniques. He also monitors German volunteers fighting for the Republican side, identifying communists and leftists for later persecution. The Spanish collaboration introduces Müller to international intelligence work and begins his relationships with foreign services connections that will prove important both during the war and, potentially, in its aftermath. Witnesses from this period describe Müller as speaking surprisingly good Spanish, adding to his known fluency in French and working knowledge of other languages. The linguistic ability, like his photographic memory, seems almost uncanny for a man of his limited formal education. 1939 brings forced membership in the Nazi Party and simultaneous promotion to head of the Gestapo. The party membership is purely bureaucratic. Himmler decides that all senior SS and police officers must be party members. Müller applies, receives his high-numbered party card, and nothing changes in his behaviour or approach. He doesn't start spouting Nazi ideology, doesn't suddenly become more enthusiastic about racial theories, doesn't pretend to a conversion. Everyone understands it's a formality. But the promotion to Gestapo chief is profoundly significant. Müller now controls the entire secret police apparatus of the Reich. Every political arrest, every interrogation, every surveillance operation crosses his desk. The Gestapo in 1939 employs approximately 32,000 people to monitor 80 million Germans. The disproportion seems impossible: one agent for every 2,500 citizens. How can such a small organisation control such a large population? The answer lies in Müller's methods: comprehensive documentation, extensive informant networks, selective terror that creates fear disproportionate to actual capacity, and above all, the reputation for knowing everything. The Gestapo doesn't need to watch everyone if everyone believes they're being watched. The relationship between Heydrich and Müller, from 1939 until Heydrich's assassination in 1942, represents one of history's most effective partnerships in organised evil. Heydrich provides vision, political protection, and connection to Hitler and Himmler. Müller provides operational excellence, administrative skill, and the ability to transform policy into action. They're not friends. Heydrich is incapable of friendship, and Müller forms no emotional attachments. But they respect each other's competence. Heydrich knows he can give Müller any order, no matter how terrible, and it will be executed precisely. Müller knows Heydrich will protect him from party rivals and ideological zealots who resent his lack of Nazi enthusiasm. The partnership works because both men understand power's actual mechanisms. They're not playing ideological games or engaging in factional politics. They're building the most efficient security apparatus in the world, and efficiency requires trust between commander and executor. When Heydrich dies in June 1942 from wounds sustained in a Czech resistance attack, Müller reportedly shows no emotion at the funeral. Witnesses remember him standing apart, watching the ceremony with his characteristic blank expression, already adapting to the new power structure under Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's replacement. Müller serves the office, not the man. And the office continues regardless of who occupies it. January 20th, 1942. Wannsee, Berlin. 15 men gather in a villa beside the Wannsee Lake on Berlin's outskirts for a conference that will last 90 minutes and condemn millions to death. Reinhard Heydrich chairs the meeting, explaining the purpose with characteristic euphemism. The final solution of the Jewish question. Most attendees are state secretaries and senior officials from various ministries: Interior, Justice, Foreign Office, the occupied territories' civil administrations. They've come to coordinate logistics for what Heydrich describes as evacuation to the east. Adolf Eichmann, who organised the conference, takes minutes. And sitting beside Heydrich, saying almost nothing, taking his own meticulous notes, is Heinrich Müller, chief of the Gestapo. The other attendees barely notice him. Some don't even remember his presence when interrogated years later. But Müller's silence is deceptive. He's not passive. He's absorbing information, understanding how different bureaucracies must interface to make genocide work, identifying potential problems in coordination. When the meeting ends, Heydrich has secured agreement from all relevant agencies, and Müller has his operational blueprint. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, is often portrayed as chaotic, driven by hate-filled mobs or sadistic camp guards. This obscures a terrible truth. Genocide requires bureaucracy, logistics, and coordination. Someone must schedule trains, allocate resources, coordinate between civilian administrators and military authorities, and SS execution units. Someone must ensure that Jews in France are rounded up using different legal pretexts than Jews in Poland, but achieve the same end result. Someone must process the reports from Einsatzgruppen units in the east, from death camps in Poland, from deportation centres across Europe, and consolidate them into comprehensive statistics. Heinrich Müller becomes that someone, not the designer of genocide that's Hitler and Himmler, and not the primary logistics coordinator that's Eichmann. But Müller is the crucial connection, the man who ensures that orders from the top actually produce results at the bottom, and that information from the bottom accurately reaches the top. Müller's role begins in earnest in the summer of 1941 when Germany invades the Soviet Union. 4 Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units follow the Wehrmacht into conquered territories with orders to murder Jews, communists, Roma, and anyone else deemed enemies of the Reich. The Einsatzgruppen commanders report through Müller's office in the RSHA. Each unit sends daily or weekly reports documenting their activities, locations, numbers killed, methods used, problems encountered, resources needed. These reports are remarkably detailed and bureaucratic. They read like industrial production summaries because that's essentially what they are. Einsatzgruppe A reports 15,000 Jews murdered in Lithuania using shooting and exhaust gas experiments. Einsatzgruppe C reports 33,000 murdered in a ravine at Babi Yar in 2 days. Müller receives these reports, has his staff compile statistics, and forwards summaries to Heydrich and Himmler. He also responds with queries and directives. Why are certain units more efficient than others? What methods minimize ammunition consumption? How can psychological stress on executioners be reduced? His memos treat murder as a problem of operational optimization. October 1941 brings a crucial directive bearing Müller's signature. Jews are prohibited from emigrating from German-controlled territories. Until this moment, Nazi policy officially favoured forced emigration, making life unbearable for Jews, so they'll leave Germany and occupied lands. Now, the door slams shut. Jews cannot leave, cannot buy their way out, cannot flee. The timing is not coincidental. The Einsatzgruppen have proven that mass murder is feasible. The Wannsee Conference is being planned. Müller's emigration ban ensures that Jews remain available for the final solution. Later, at Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, this directive is introduced as evidence. Eichmann testifies that Müller personally told him emigration must stop because it interfered with more comprehensive measures. The bureaucratic language masks genocide, but everyone involved understood the meaning. The deportation machine requires Müller's coordinating hand throughout 1942 and 1943. France poses particular challenges, different occupation zones, semi-independent Vichy government need to maintain appearances of legality. Müller coordinates between the German military command, the SS, the French police, and the railway authorities. He signs the orders that deploy Eichmann's deportation specialists to Paris. He approves the use of French police for roundups, the most infamous being the Val d'Hiv raid in July 1942, when French police arrest 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children, and hold them in appalling conditions before deportation to Auschwitz. Similar coordination occurs for Holland, Belgium, Greece, Hungary. Each country presents unique problems of jurisdiction, local collaboration, transportation, logistics. Müller's office functions as the central switching station, ensuring that different bureaucracies work together despite institutional rivalries and competing priorities. The numbers are staggering, and Müller sees them all. The Höfler telegram, intercepted by British intelligence and decoded after the war, provides a glimpse into the reporting system. Sent in January 1943 by Hermann Höfle, Eichmann's deputy for Operation Reinhard, the telegram reports totals from 4 death camps: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek. Over 1,270,000 people murdered in the year 1942 alone. This telegram would have passed through Müller's office as part of routine reporting. How does someone read such numbers without reaction? Eichmann, testifying in Jerusalem, describes Müller as having a memory like an elephant. He knew every transport schedule, every camp's capacity, every local commander's capabilities. He could recite from memory how many Jews had been deported from any given city weeks or months earlier. But he showed no emotion about these figures, treating them like any other administrative data. Eichmann, who considered himself hardened, admitted that Müller frightened him. At least Eichmann could claim he was following orders and lacked authority to change anything. Müller had authority. He could have slowed things down, created bureaucratic obstacles, saved some lives at the margins. He never did. Unlike some Nazi leaders, Müller maintained strict separation between his work and personal life. He lived in a modest apartment with his wife and 4 children. Neighbours described him as quiet, correct, uninvolved in the community. He left for work early, returned late, never discussed his job. Whether this represented psychological compartmentalization or something more disturbing, a genuine inability to connect his bureaucratic murder and human reality remains unclear. His wife's later testimony suggests she knew in general terms what the Gestapo did, but not specifics. The children were kept entirely ignorant. Müller apparently never showed signs of stress, never drank heavily, never had nightmares or breakdowns. He processed industrialized murder the way another man might process insurance claims, with the same emotional detachment and attention to procedural detail. The scale of documentation is part of what makes Müller's disappearance so puzzling. His signature appears on approximately 70,000 documents that survive in archives worldwide. Deportation orders, execution authorizations, intelligence directives, interrogation summaries, coordination memos. The paper trail is overwhelming, far more extensive than for Eichmann or most other Holocaust perpetrators. Müller signed everything, insisted on proper documentation, maintained meticulous files. He created the evidence that proves his guilt beyond any possible doubt. Yet he also vanished so completely that his fate remains unknown 80 years later. The contrast suggests something important about his character. Müller believed in documentation because it made systems work efficiently. But his personal disappearance demonstrates that he understood when documentation became liability. He could shift from being the most documented Nazi to leaving no trace at all. This flexibility, this ability to become whatever the situation required, makes him more disturbing than ideologically driven killers. They at least had consistent principles, however monstrous. Müller had only situational adaptation, unlimited competence in service of whoever held power, and no moral framework that could limit his actions. By 1943, as the Holocaust reaches its peak of industrial efficiency, Heinrich Müller stands at the centre of the machinery of death. Not the most visible perpetrator that's Hitler or Himmler. Not the most enthusiastic ideologue that's Heydrich or any number of true believers, but the most essential functionary, the man who makes the system work despite the incredible complexity of murdering millions across a continent while simultaneously fighting a world war. The desk murderer, they'll call him later. A man who killed more people than perhaps anyone in history except Stalin or Mao, and who did it all from behind a desk with signatures on paperwork. When the Nuremberg prosecutors later try to understand how the Holocaust happened, they keep returning to men like Müller not because they invented genocide, but because they made it possible. Evil ideas are frighteningly common. The rarer quality, the truly dangerous one, is the ability to transform evil ideas into working reality with bureaucratic efficiency and no moral hesitation. Heinrich Müller possessed that quality in its purest form, and history has no certain answer for what happened to him when his empire collapsed. November 9th, 1939, Venlo, Netherlands. 2 British intelligence officers sit in a cafe near the Dutch-German border waiting for a contact who claims to represent anti-Nazi officers planning a coup against Hitler. Major Richard Stevens and Captain Sigismund Payne-Best have met this contact, who calls himself Captain Schemmel, several times over the past 2 weeks. Today, Schemmel promises they'll meet the actual German generals. The British agents believe they've penetrated the highest levels of the Wehrmacht resistance. They're wrong. Captain Schemmel is an SD officer named Walter Schellenberg, and the entire operation is a trap organised by Heinrich Müller and Reinhard Heydrich. At precisely the arranged meeting time, a black Mercedes crashes through the border barrier. SS commandos leap out, guns drawn. Stevens and Best have barely registered what's happening before they're beaten unconscious, thrown into the car, and driven into Germany. A Dutch intelligence officer with them dies in the initial shooting. The Venlo incident, as it becomes known, represents one of Müller's greatest counterintelligence successes and demonstrates his understanding that intelligence work is patient, methodical, and requires the ability to think several steps ahead of opponents. The Venlo operation yields extraordinary results beyond just capturing 2 British agents. Stevens and Best, interrogated by Müller personally over several weeks, reveal the entire structure of British intelligence networks in Western Europe. They provide names, addresses, communication methods, safe houses. They describe how MI6 recruits and trains agents, what targets they prioritise, what codes they use. Stevens even carries documents that compromise additional operations. Müller doesn't torture them, he doesn't need to. Exhaustion, isolation, skilled psychological manipulation, and the shock of capture prove sufficient. Within months, British intelligence networks in Holland and Belgium are rolled up. Dozens of agents are arrested or turned. The damage to Allied intelligence efforts is catastrophic and takes years to rebuild. But Müller's achievement goes beyond immediate tactical gains. The Venlo incident teaches him how vulnerable Allied services are to patient, sophisticated operations. It proves that British intelligence, though experienced, can be outplayed by superior preparation and operational security. 1940 and 41 bring the Gestapo into direct conflict with every Allied intelligence service operating in Europe. The British SOE, Special Operations Executive, begins parachuting agents into occupied territories to organise resistance and sabotage. Soviet intelligence runs networks of spies throughout Germany and occupied lands. The Polish government in exile maintains contact with underground fighters. The Americans, though not yet in the war, conduct intelligence operations through diplomatic cover. Müller coordinates counterintelligence against all of them. His advantage is structural. He controls both the Gestapo and, after Heydrich's death, significant influence over foreign intelligence operations. He can coordinate surveillance across borders, share information between occupied territories, deploy resources wherever threats emerge. And he has something Allied services lack: unlimited willingness to use torture, execute civilians as examples, and hold hostages to force cooperation. The Rote-Kapelle network's Red Orchestra in German terminology provide Müller with his greatest counterintelligence triumph. Soviet intelligence runs extensive spy rings throughout occupied Europe, transmitting military intelligence back to Moscow. The networks include hundreds of agents: German anti-Nazis, communists, Jews seeking to strike back, and opportunists. Müller begins detecting their radio transmissions in 1941. But rather than immediately arresting everyone, he does what he does best: watches and maps. His radio detection units triangulate transmissions. His analysts decrypt messages. His surveillance teams follow suspected agents for months, documenting every contact. By late 1942, Müller has a complete picture organisational structure, communication methods, every major participant. Then, simultaneously across Germany, Belgium, Holland, and France, the Gestapo strikes. Hundreds arrested in coordinated raids. The Rote-Kapelle networks essentially cease to exist. Soviet intelligence loses its primary sources inside Germany. And Müller has demonstrated that patience in counterintelligence produces better results than reactive arrests. Operation North Pole in Holland demonstrates Müller's ruthless sophistication. British SOE parachutes agent after agent into occupied Holland throughout 1942 and 43. The Germans capture the first agent, force him to continue radio transmissions, and use his codes to request additional agents. The British, despite the captured agent omitting his security check, continue sending people and supplies. For nearly 2 years, Müller's operation runs captured radios, bringing in over 50 Allied agents who are arrested immediately upon landing. The operation provides vast intelligence about British methods, codes, equipment, and training. It also allows Müller to feed disinformation back to London, shaping British understanding of conditions in Holland. The full extent of the disaster only becomes clear after the war, when surviving agents describe their capture and the Germans' mockery of British intelligence failures. Müller personally supervised the operation, reviewing transcripts of radio messages. approving the disinformation fed to London, deciding when to arrest new arrivals. His ability to maintain such complex deception for 2 years, while managing countless other operations, demonstrates remarkable administrative capacity. Müller's linguistic abilities prove crucial to his intelligence work. Most senior Nazis speak only German. Himmler has limited English. Heydrich speaks French, but poorly. Müller, by contrast, speaks fluent French, working Russian, Italian, and serviceable English. He can interrogate prisoners directly, without interpreters, reading nuance and psychology that translation loses. He can read captured documents in original languages. Witnesses describe him conducting interrogations in French with Belgian resistance members, in Italian with captured agents, in broken but functional English with British prisoners. For a working-class Munich native with limited formal education, this linguistic range is extraordinary. It suggests either natural ability or years of dedicated self-education. Either way, it makes him far more effective in counterintelligence work than colleagues who require translators. The July 20th, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime becomes Müller's greatest domestic intelligence success. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg places a bomb in Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, but Hitler survives with minor injuries. The conspiracy begins unraveling immediately. Müller, already suspicious of Wehrmacht officers based on years of surveillance, has files prepared on potential resistors. Within hours of the failed assassination, Gestapo teams begin arrests. Müller personally conducts interrogations of senior conspirators, extracting confessions that implicate thousands of officers, civil servants, and aristocrats. Over 5,000 people are arrested in the investigation's aftermath. Approximately 200 are executed, including field marshals, generals, and members of Germany's oldest noble families. Müller's interrogations produce detailed confessions about the conspiracy's full extent, participants, planning, and objectives. His reports to Hitler help identify the military opposition's complete network, allowing the regime to purge any potential resistance within the Wehrmacht. The psychological profile that emerges from Müller's interrogation techniques is disturbing. He doesn't rely primarily on physical torture, though that's always available as an option. His preferred method is marathon sessions lasting 12, 15, 20 hours. He sits across from prisoners, asking questions in a calm, patient voice, returning again and again to the same topics from different angles, finding contradictions, expanding them, breaking down resistance through exhaustion and precision rather than violence. Prisoners describe him as eerily calm, never showing anger or frustration, treating interrogation as intellectual exercise. He has the file on the prisoner, memorized every friend, every conversation, every detail of their life. He knows things that should be impossible to know, creating the impression that resistance is futile because the Gestapo already knows everything. This psychological warfare often proves more effective than beating. Torture might produce false confessions. Müller's methods produce real information, names, plans, organizational charts that lead to further arrests. By 1945, Heinrich Müller commands the most sophisticated counterintelligence apparatus in the world. Every Allied intelligence operation in German-controlled territory contends with his networks. His files contain thousands of dossiers on suspected agents, collaborators, resistance members. His radio intercept units monitor hundreds of frequencies. His informant networks penetrate resistance groups throughout occupied Europe. The statistics are stark. British estimates suggest approximately 80% of Allied agents deployed into Germany were captured or turned. Soviet intelligence networks suffered similar losses. The French resistance, despite Hollywood's romantic portrayals, operated under constant Gestapo pressure, with cells regularly penetrated and destroyed. None of this exonerates the Allies' own mistakes: poor security, inadequate training, operational failures. But Müller's competence magnified every Allied error. He was, quite simply, better at counterintelligence than most Allied services were at intelligence. This expertise, this accumulated knowledge of Western and Soviet intelligence methods, structures, and personnel will become profoundly relevant when Müller disappears. It's the most valuable commodity he possesses, worth more than gold or jewels. It's the kind of knowledge that could buy protection from whoever won the war, if he survived to sell it. February 12, 1944, Berlin. Wilhelm Schmidhuber, an Abwehr officer, walks into Gestapo headquarters carrying a briefcase full of documents. He's defecting from German military intelligence to the SS security service, and he brings explosive material, evidence that Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, has protected anti-Nazi officers, maintained contacts with foreign intelligence services, and possibly committed treason. Heinrich Müller personally debriefs Schmidhuber over several days, and the information confirms what Müller has suspected for years. Canaris, ostensibly serving the Reich, has run the Abwehr as a refuge for officers who oppose Hitler. The timing of Schmidhuber's defection is not coincidental. The Abwehr has been losing bureaucratic battles with the SS for a decade, and Müller has been building the case against Canaris file by file, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment has arrived. Within 2 months, Hitler will dissolve the Abwehr entirely and transfer all military intelligence functions to the RSHA. Müller will absorb his rival organization, eliminate Canaris, and consolidate control over every intelligence and security function in the Reich. The Abwehr wars demonstrate Müller's capacity for patient, ruthless institutional predation. The conflict between the Abwehr and the Gestapo begins almost immediately after the Nazis take power in 1933. The Abwehr is military intelligence, reporting to the Wehrmacht High Command, responsible for espionage abroad, counterintelligence in military matters, and sabotage operations. The Gestapo is political police, initially focused on domestic security, but expanding constantly into foreign intelligence through the SD. The jurisdictional boundaries are unclear and constantly contested. Who investigates foreign spies in Germany, military counterintelligence, or the Gestapo? Who runs agents abroad, Abwehr or SD? Who interrogates captured enemy officers, military intelligence, or Müller's people? In 1936, the organizations sign an agreement called the Ten Commandments, supposedly defining their respective spheres. The document is ignored by both sides from its signing. Müller, methodical as always, documents every violation by Abwehr officers, building files that will prove useful later. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris becomes Abwehr chief in 1935 and immediately represents everything Müller is not. Canaris is aristocratic, multilingual, cultured, politically connected, and most importantly, morally conflicted about Nazism. He's not a resistance member exactly, not actively working against the regime, but he's deeply uncomfortable with Nazi methods and policies. He uses the Abwehr to shelter officers who share his doubts. He maintains contacts with British intelligence that probably exceed his official brief. He provides incomplete information about resistance groups, allowing some conspirators to escape detection. Hans Oster, Canaris's deputy, actively assists the resistance, warning the Dutch of the impending German invasion in 1940 and maintaining contacts with plotters against Hitler. Müller knows much of this. His surveillance of the Abwehr begins in the late 1930s and intensifies throughout the war. But he doesn't immediately move against Canaris. Instead, he documents everything, understanding that institutional warfare requires patience and perfect timing. The differences in organizational culture make conflict inevitable. The Abwehr recruits from aristocratic military families, values traditional notions of honor, and maintains pre-Nazi codes of conduct regarding prisoners and civilian populations. Officers like Canaris and Oster see themselves as German patriots, serving the nation rather than the Nazi party. Müller's Gestapo recruits from police, party functionaries, and men without aristocratic pretensions. They value efficiency, loyalty to the regime, and ideological commitment. Abwehr officers often look down on Gestapo personnel as thugs and careerists. Gestapo officers see Abwehr personnel as suspect aristocrats more loyal to class than nation. Müller exploits these cultural tensions, using Abwehr officers' disdain for the Gestapo as evidence of their insufficient loyalty to National Socialism. Specific incidents provide Müller with ammunition. In 1940, an Abwehr officer named Hans von Dornani helped several Jews escape Germany by recruiting them as fake Abwehr agents, Operation U7. The operation is humanitarian, using Abwehr cover to save lives. Müller's investigation reveals it in 1943. Rather than immediate arrests, Müller files the evidence away, waiting for maximum political impact. In 1943, Abwehr officers are implicated in the failed attempt to assassinate Hitler by blowing up his aeroplane. Müller investigates thoroughly, documenting Abwehr connections to resistance circles. Each incident, each documented contact between Abwehr personnel and potential resistors adds to Müller's files. He's building a comprehensive case not just against individual officers, but against the entire organization. The February 1944 Schmidhuber defection provides the final evidence Müller needs. Schmidhuber brings documents showing that Canaris maintained unauthorized contacts with Allied intelligence services, that Abwehr officers systematically undermined Nazi policies, that the organization functions as a haven for regime opponents. Müller presents this material to Himmler, who brings it to Hitler. The Führer, already suspicious of the military after multiple assassination attempts, is receptive. On February 18th, 1944, Hitler orders the Abwehr dissolved. All military intelligence functions transfer to the RSHA under Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Heydrich's successor. Müller, as operational chief of the RSHA, effectively controls what was his rival organization. Thousands of Abwehr personnel suddenly report to him. Files, networks, operations, all transfer to his control. It's a complete bureaucratic victory, achieved through years of patient documentation and waiting for opponents to provide sufficient evidence for their own destruction. Canaris is placed under house arrest, initially treated with some courtesy due to his rank in service. But Müller never stops investigating. After the July 20th plot, Müller's interrogations of conspirators reveal additional evidence of Canaris's knowledge of resistance plans. Whether Canaris actively participated or simply knew and didn't report remains debated, but for Müller, the distinction is irrelevant. In April 1945, as the Reich collapses, Canaris is transferred to Flossenbürg concentration camp. He's executed on April 9th, hanged slowly for maximum suffering on direct orders from Hitler, probably based on evidence from Müller's investigations. Hans Oster, his deputy, is executed the same day. Other Abwehr officers connected to resistance activities are killed in the final weeks of the war. Müller's victory is complete. His institutional rival is not just defeated but destroyed, its leaders dead, its personnel absorbed or dismissed, its functions subsumed into his organization. The Abwehr wars reveal crucial aspects of Müller's character and methodology. First, he thinks long-term, building cases over years rather than months, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Second, he understands institutional politics, recognizing that destroying rival organizations requires not just evidence of wrongdoing, but the right political climate for action. Third, he's patient, willing to tolerate opponents when they're protected by powerful patrons, but ready to move decisively when protection weakens. Fourth, and perhaps most disturbing, he shows no hesitation about destroying fellow Germans, serving the state simply because they represent institutional competition. For Müller, there's no loyalty to shared national purpose, no recognition that Abwehr officers fighting Allied intelligence agencies are on the same side. There's only organizational advancement and consolidation of power. By early 1945, Müller controls an empire. The Gestapo, the SD Foreign Intelligence Service, and the absorbed Abwehr functions all report through his office. He commands approximately 50,000 personnel. His budget runs to 80 million Reichsmarks annually. His jurisdiction extends across all German-controlled territories. He has files on millions of people, runs thousands of informants, monitors every potential source of resistance or opposition. It's unprecedented consolidation of intelligence and security functions, making Müller arguably the most powerful police official in history. Not the most visible, that's still Himmler or Kaltenbrunner in the public hierarchy, but the most operationally effective, the man who actually makes the machinery function. This empire, this accumulated power and knowledge and institutional control, makes his disappearance even more puzzling. Men with such power typically fight to preserve it, go down defending their positions, or bargain their knowledge for mercy. Müller apparently does none of these things. He simply walks away from the largest security apparatus ever built, leaving his empire to collapse without him. Understanding why requires understanding his final months, when the institutional framework he served begins its terminal disintegration. January 16th, 1945, Berlin. Heinrich Müller sits at his desk in Gestapo headquarters reading intelligence reports that describe military catastrophe in every direction. Soviet forces have broken through German lines in Poland and are racing toward Berlin. In the West, American and British armies recover from the Battle of the Bulge and prepare final drives into Germany proper. The Reich is collapsing, infrastructure is devastated, and everyone knows defeat is inevitable. But Müller continues processing paperwork with the same methodical attention he brought to the task when Germany was conquering Europe. His secretary will later testify that Müller worked through these final months as if nothing fundamental had changed, arriving at 8 every morning, leaving late every night, signing documents, issuing orders, maintaining routines, even as their meaning evaporates. The twilight of the gods, Götterdämmerung in German mythology, describes this period perfectly. The Nazi Empire burns, its leaders face death or capture, and Heinrich Müller continues to file reports. The RSHA begins systematic evacuation of files in mid-January. Müller personally supervises the operation, making decisions about what to preserve and what to destroy. Truckloads of documents are shipped south to Bavaria and Austria, supposedly, to continue operations from remaining German-held territory. But the selection process reveals something interesting. Müller orders some files destroyed that might seem important, detailed records of routine Gestapo operations, internal administrative documents, bureaucratic correspondence. He preserves others that seem less essential to immediate operations, certain intelligence files about foreign networks, documents regarding Allied agents, materials that might have future value. Subordinates notice the inconsistency but don't question it. Years later, investigators will wonder whether Müller was already thinking beyond the Reich's defeat, selecting documents that might serve as insurance or currency in whatever came next. February brings increasing disconnection from reality at the top levels of Nazi leadership. Hitler retreats into the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing orders to armies that no longer exist, moving divisions on maps that have long since been destroyed. Himmler begins secret negotiations with the Western Allies, hoping to save himself by offering to surrender German forces separately from Hitler. Goering schemes to take power as Hitler's successor. Bormann plots against all rivals. Müller observes this disintegration without apparent emotional reaction. He continues reporting to Kaltenbrunner, who reports to Himmler, maintaining chains of command even as everyone around him engages in betrayal and desperation. His professionalism during this period is almost surreal, like a butler maintaining perfect service as the mansion burns around him. The interrogation of survivors from the Yalta Conference provides a glimpse of Müller's mindset in February. Allied leaders met at Yalta to plan post-war Europe, and German intelligence desperately seeks information about the conference's conclusions. Someone in the Soviet or Western delegations leaks details. Müller interrogates the source and anyone connected to the leak with his usual thoroughness. The transcripts survive and are remarkable. Germany is clearly losing the war. The end is perhaps 3 months away. Yet Müller conducts these interrogations with the same careful methodology he'd use in peacetime. He builds detailed confessions, documents every connection, follows every lead. To what purpose? The information has no operational value. Germany lacks the capacity to use whatever is learned. But Müller continues, because that's what he does. He interrogates, he documents, he processes information. The approaching apocalypse doesn't change his procedures. April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, and the last time most senior Nazi leaders see the Führer. Soviet artillery can be heard in the city. Bombers conduct constant raids. The government has effectively ceased functioning, but Hitler holds a birthday reception in the bunker, and the surviving leadership attends. Goering comes, Himmler comes, Speer comes, Bormann, and Goebbels attend, and Heinrich Müller is there as well. Witnesses later describe the surreal atmosphere, forced cheerfulness, toasts to victory, denial of obvious reality. After the reception, most attendees flee Berlin. Goering heads south, Himmler north, Speer to Hamburg. Müller returns to his office. His wife and children testify this was the last time he visited the family apartment, a brief stop that seemed routine rather than farewell. He gave no indication of special plans, left no instructions for their future, provided no money or resources. Then he went back to work. April 28th brings news that must have crystallized certain realities for Müller. Himmler's negotiations with the Western Allies become public. Hitler, informed of his loyal Heinrich's betrayal, flies into one of his final rages. Himmler is declared a traitor, stripped of all offices, ordered arrested if found. For Müller, this means his ultimate superior has committed treason and the entire SS command structure is compromised. To whom does he report? Kaltenbrunner? Hitler directly? The bureaucratic framework that governed his entire career has collapsed. Witnesses in the bunker complex report seeing Müller that day, moving between offices, speaking to no one, carrying files. What was in those files? What was he arranging? No one knows. He conducted no final meetings, gave no farewell speeches, displayed no emotion about the Reich's end or Himmler's betrayal. April 29th, at approximately 10 in the evening, marks Heinrich Müller's last confirmed appearance in history. He's seen in the bunker complex by multiple witnesses. He wears civilian clothes under his SS uniform, a detail several people notice and remember. He tells the duty officer he's going to check the defensive positions, a plausible explanation given the Soviet forces fighting street by street toward the bunker. He leaves the bunker complex. He never returns. Hours later, Hitler will marry Eva Braun and dictate his final testament. The next day, April 30th, Hitler and Braun will commit suicide. May 1st, Goebbels and his wife will kill their children and themselves. May 2nd, the Berlin garrison will surrender to Soviet forces. But Heinrich Müller is already gone, vanished into the chaos of Berlin's final battle. The circumstances of his disappearance provide crucial clues about his intentions. The civilian clothes under the uniform suggest preparation for discarding his SS identity. The absence of farewell or final arrangements indicates he either planned this exit or was improvising rapidly. The timing before Hitler's death, before the final collapse, suggests he chose his moment rather than being trapped by events. Most significantly, his family receives no contact, no resources, no explanation. This differs markedly from other Nazi officials who made some provision for their families, even when fleeing. Müller's complete abandonment of wife and children implies either callousness beyond measure or such deep operational security that even family contact would compromise whatever he planned next. The chaos of Berlin in late April and early May 1945 provides perfect conditions for disappearance. 2 million people crowd the city, mixing with millions more fleeing from the east. Soviet bombardment has destroyed infrastructure, records, normal identification systems. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers shed uniforms and try to blend into civilian populations. Thousands commit suicide daily. Bodies lie unidentified in rubble. Multiple armies operate in confined space, Wehrmacht remnants, SS units, Soviet assault forces, eventually American and British troops in western suburbs. Normal chains of custody and documentation have completely broken down. If someone wanted to vanish, to shed one identity and assume another, these conditions are ideal. Müller, who spent his career making people disappear, must have understood this better than almost anyone. The question that will haunt investigators for decades is deceptively simple. Did Müller have a plan, or did he improvise? The evidence suggests both. Certain actions, the selective file preservation, the acquisition of civilian clothes, possibly arranging false documents in advance, indicate preparation. Other aspects, the timing, the lack of family provisions, the absence of any detectable post-war activity suggest either brilliant improvisation or simple death in the chaos. Müller was capable of long-term planning. His entire career demonstrated patience and preparation. But he was also adaptable, able to serve different masters, change allegiances when necessary, assess situations coldly, and act accordingly. Perhaps the truth is that Müller prepared options without committing to any particular course, then made his final decision in those last days based on whatever opportunities the chaos presented. A man who trusts no one, plans for every contingency, and commits to nothing until the final moment, that description fits Heinrich Müller perfectly. As the Reich entered its final hours, he simply walked away from the stage, leaving history to puzzle over where he went and why. April 29th, 1945, 10:32 in the evening. Berlin. The duty officer at the Führerbunker complex makes his hourly notation in the logbook, recording movements in and out of the fortified underground structures. He notes that SS Gruppenführer Heinrich Müller departed at 2200 hours 10 o'clock evening, stating his intention to inspect defensive positions in the government quarter. The officer thinks nothing of it. Senior officials move constantly between the bunker, the nearby Reich Chancellery, and forward positions as Soviet forces tighten their grip on central Berlin. Artillery fire echoes constantly, occasionally close enough to shower concrete dust from the bunker ceilings. The duty officer makes his notation, turns to other tasks, and never sees Müller again. This logbook entry, preserved by chance in Soviet archives, represents the last documentary evidence that Heinrich Müller exists. After this moment, he becomes a ghost, a mystery, one of history's most confounding disappearing acts. What happens in the next 72 hours will be investigated by multiple intelligence services, analysed by historians for 8 decades, and never definitively solved. The known facts are remarkably sparse. April 30th, Hitler commits suicide in the bunker. Müller is not present, not among those who view the bodies, not recorded as attending any of the final meetings. May 1st, Soviet forces are 3 blocks from the Reich Chancellery, fighting building to building. Surviving Nazi leadership attempts break out from the bunker complex, several groups making desperate runs through Soviet lines. Müller is not documented as part of any breakout group. May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrenders. Soviet NKVD teams move immediately to Gestapo headquarters and the bunker complex, searching specifically for senior Nazi officials. Müller is not found. The searches continue for weeks. Müller remains absent. Soviet Lieutenant Pavel Ivanov, assigned to locate Müller, interviews hundreds of German prisoners in the first days after surrender. He finds dozens of people who saw Müller during April in the bunker, at Gestapo headquarters, moving between offices, but no one remembers seeing him after the evening of April 29th. Several witnesses report that in his final appearances, Müller seemed preternaturally calm, showing none of the panic or desperation visible in other officials. One subordinate remembers Müller sorting files in his office on April 28th, burning some documents while carefully packing others in a small leather case. When asked where the files were going, Müller simply said, "Insurance." Another witness, a secretary, recalls Müller. On April 29th, wearing civilian clothes under his uniform, unusual enough that she mentioned it to colleagues, the uniform would identify him instantly as a high-ranking SS officer. The civilian clothes suggested preparation to shed that identity. One tantalizing report surfaces weeks after the surrender. A Soviet soldier interrogated in May about operations near Lehrte Station, a rail terminal northwest of the government quarter, mentions seeing a German officer matching Müller's description on May 1st. The officer wore a Wehrmacht uniform without insignia, was moving purposefully rather than fleeing in panic, and carried a briefcase. The Soviet soldier, focused on combat rather than captures, didn't stop the man. The report is filed, investigated, and ultimately leads nowhere. Lehrte Station becomes a recurring location in Müller theories, a logical point to attempt escape from central Berlin, connected to remaining transportation networks, far enough from the bunker that Soviet forces might be less organised. But proving this sighting was actually, Müller proves impossible. In a city of 2 million people, hundreds of thousands in military uniform, during the chaos of Conquest, identifying one specific man from a brief sighting asks too much of evidence. The American Counterintelligence Corps arrives in Berlin in June and begins its own investigation. They approach the problem differently than the Soviets, focusing on Müller's potential escape routes rather than immediate capture. CIC officers interview Müller's family repeatedly. Sophie Müller and her 4 children maintain consistent testimony. Heinrich visited briefly on April 20th, seemed normal, made no arrangements for their future, and never contacted them again. The Americans searched the apartment thoroughly, finding nothing, suggesting escape preparations, no hidden money, no foreign currency, no false identification documents, no addresses of safe houses. The family's financial situation is desperate. If Müller escaped with resources, he shared none with his wife and children. The CIC finds this abandonment either highly suspicious or darkly revealing about Müller's psychology. 1946 brings the first wave of reported sightings, beginning a pattern that will continue for decades. Müller is seen in Munich, working under an assumed name for a trucking company. Investigated proves false wrong, man. Müller is reported in Soviet-occupied East Germany, recognized by a former Gestapo officer. Investigated, the witness is unreliable, probably seeking favor with American intelligence. Müller surfaces in Argentina, supposedly living in the German community in Buenos Aires. The report comes from an informant 3 times removed from the actual sighting. Investigation produces nothing concrete. Every lead is followed, every sighting investigated, and every investigation ends the same way. Mistaken identity, unreliable witnesses, or deliberate fabrication. The Müller sightings become their own phenomenon, says more about post-war anxiety and the hunger for Nazi hunting than about Müller's actual fate. The grave mystery emerges in the early 1950s when cemetery records from Berlin are systematically examined. A Jewish cemetery in the city's western section contains a grave marked Heinrich Müller, born 1900, died May 1945. The dates roughly match the Gestapo chief, though the birth date is slightly off. West German prosecutors, preparing potential war crimes cases, order investigation. The cemetery caretaker has no clear memory. The grave was one of dozens filled during Berlin's final battles. Bodies often unidentified, records kept haphazardly, if at all. Heinrich Müller was an extraordinarily common name in Germany, equivalent to John Smith in America. The prosecutors note the grave's existence, but lack resources to exhume without stronger evidence. The question of Soviet capture becomes central to Western intelligence analysis by the late 1940s. The NKVD's intensive search for Müller is well documented. They devoted substantial resources specifically to finding the Gestapo chief. They interrogated hundreds of prisoners about him. They searched every building in the government quarter. Beria personally inquired about the investigation's progress. This intensity suggests Müller's intelligence value, his knowledge of Western networks, his interrogation expertise. Several CIA analysts in the 1950s conclude that if Müller survived, the Soviets most likely captured him. But then the analysis encounters a paradox. Why would the Soviets remain silent about such a capture? Parading captured Nazi leaders as war criminals served Soviet propaganda purposes. They tried and executed many senior Nazis publicly. Keeping Müller secret only makes sense if they used him as an intelligence asset, which would require offering him immunity from prosecution. The speculation remains precisely that speculation without confirming evidence. By 1960, West German authorities officially declare Heinrich Müller dead. Death date and location unknown. The legal declaration closes the last formal investigation into his fate. No war crimes trial will occur. No prosecution can proceed. The man who signed tens of thousands of death warrants escapes all earthly justice, either through actual death in Berlin's chaos or through successful disappearance. The declaration satisfies administrative requirements but answers nothing. Sophie Müller, declared a widow, receives a minor pension. The children change their names, seeking escape from their father's legacy. The historical record contains a gap, a missing conclusion, an absence where there should be resolution. Heinrich Müller walked into the chaos of Berlin's final hours and vanished as completely as the millions he helped murder. The symmetry is disturbing. The lack of closure, perhaps a kind of justice, his absence from history, a permanent question mark, a reminder that some evils resist even the closure of documentation and trial. July 15th, 1945. NKVD headquarters, Lubyanka prison, Moscow. Lavrenti Beria sits in his office reviewing reports from Berlin operations, and his frustration is evident in the margins he scrawls across documents. Where is Müller? He writes on one report, this must be highest priority, on another. Unacceptable that Gestapo chief remains unlocated, on a third. Beria, Stalin's secret police chief, understands intelligence value better than most. Heinrich Müller knows the identity of every Western spy who was captured by the Gestapo, some potentially turned and released, now operating throughout occupied Germany. Müller knows Allied intelligence structures, methods, codes, procedures. He supervised interrogations of hundreds of British, American, and Soviet agents. He represents perhaps the single most valuable intelligence asset from the Nazi regime, more useful than scientists or generals because his knowledge concerns ongoing Allied operations. And Beria cannot find him. The NKVD has captured thousands of Nazi officials, processed millions of prisoners, and occupied all of Berlin. Yet the most wanted intelligence target has vanished completely. Unless the absence of evidence means something different than failure. Unless Müller is already here, somewhere in the Soviet security apparatus, hidden so deeply that even internal NKVD reports don't mention him. The theory that Müller surrendered to Soviet intelligence and worked for them post-war is the most controversial and unproven explanation for his disappearance. It relies on circumstantial evidence, logical deduction about intelligence priorities, and gaps in Soviet archives that may or may not be significant. The strongest argument in favor of Soviet capture is motive and opportunity. Müller had extraordinary intelligence value to the Soviets. He could identify Western intelligence networks, describe Allied interrogation methods, provide details about anti-Soviet operations. Müller also had strong motive to approach the Soviets facing certain execution by Western allies for war crimes. He might calculate that Soviet intelligence would value his knowledge over ideological revenge. The Soviets occupied Berlin, controlled all territory where Müller was last seen, and conducted the most intensive search for him. If anyone could have found Müller, it was the NKVD. Circumstantial evidence from the immediate post-war period suggests Soviet intelligence held something back. The NKVD captured Müller's immediate subordinates, his secretary, his chauffeur, dozens of Gestapo officers who worked with him. All were interrogated extensively about Müller's whereabouts, plans, statements in final days. The interrogation transcripts survive in Russian archives, except certain sections are redacted, even in documents declassified in the 1990s. Why redact information about a Nazi war criminal's disappearance 70 years after the fact? The official explanation is protection of sources and methods, but what methods remain relevant from 1945? Some researchers suggest the redactions protect something more sensitive. Evidence that the NKVD found Müller and made arrangements that remain embarrassing even after the Cold War's end. A 1948 report from a Soviet defector to American intelligence claims that Müller was seen in NKVD headquarters in Moscow. The defector, whose reliability is questionable and whose motives for defection included potential fabrication to increase his value to the Americans, describes a man matching Müller's description being escorted through Lubyanka under guard, consulting with Soviet interrogators on techniques and Western intelligence structures. The CIA investigates the report, files it as uncorroborated single-source intelligence, and ultimately dismisses it. But the report isn't unique. Over the next 3 decades, several Soviet defectors make similar claims. Müller in Moscow, Müller training KGB interrogators, Müller providing consultation on counterintelligence operations. None provides conclusive proof. None has photographs, documents, or verifiable confirmation. But the consistency of the reports across multiple unconnected sources keeps the theory alive. 1963 brings renewed attention when the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem puts the Holocaust back in international focus. Prosecutors preparing documentation about the Reich Security Main Office notice the anomaly. Every senior official accounted for except Müller. Soviet representatives at international conferences are asked directly about their investigation of Müller. The responses are oddly evasive. The investigation continues. One Soviet official says, though by 1963 the investigation is 18 years old, no evidence of survival has been confirmed. Says another, a careful negative that doesn't actually claim they searched unsuccessfully. The evasion might mean nothing, Soviet bureaucratic habit of revealing no information unnecessarily. Or it might suggest discomfort with questions that probe too close to classified operations. The most intriguing evidence comes from a 1971 Czech defector who worked in St. B Czechoslovak intelligence, trained by and working closely with the KGB. He claims that in the 1950s, Soviet instructors teaching advanced interrogation techniques referenced a German consultant they called the Professor, who had extensive experience with both Western and Soviet methods. The consultant was never named, never seen by Czech trainees, but Soviet instructors quoted his advice and methodologies. The defector, interviewed by CIA officers, describes these methodologies, and they match Müller's documented techniques from Gestapo, interrogations, marathon sessions, psychological manipulation, exhaustion rather than torture. Could the professor have been Müller? Possibly. Could this be coincidence? Soviet methods evolving independently in similar directions? Also possible. The evidence proves nothing definitively, but adds to the accumulation of suggestions. The counter-arguments against Soviet capture are equally compelling. First, why would the Soviets maintain absolute silence about capturing such a significant Nazi? They tried and executed many senior Nazis publicly. Why not Müller? The answer, that he was more valuable as intelligence asset, requires believing the Soviets would grant immunity to a Holocaust architect, which contradicts Soviet post-war justice narratives. Second, no Soviet document explicitly confirming Müller's capture has ever surfaced despite extensive post-Cold War access to archives. Russian intelligence services deny any knowledge of Müller's fate beyond the failed search in 1945. Third, turned Nazis who worked for Soviets, and there were several, including scientists and lower-ranking intelligence officers, have been documented in opened archives. Why would Müller alone remain completely hidden? The most damning counter-argument is pragmatic. Müller's intelligence value would have declined rapidly after 1945. Western intelligence networks were rebuilt with new personnel and methods. Soviet intelligence evolved its own techniques. Müller's knowledge would become increasingly outdated. By the 1950s, he'd be of limited use. Why maintain secrecy about an aging Nazi whose information grows stale? Unless the secrecy itself is the point, unless revealing Müller's cooperation would expose something else, the Soviets prefer hidden, perhaps extent of penetration of Western intelligence, perhaps compromise of Allied war crimes, prosecutions, perhaps embarrassment of having offered immunity to a Holocaust perpetrator. Analysis of Müller's personality cuts both directions on the Soviet capture theory. Would a man who fought communists his entire career agree to work for them? But Müller wasn't anti-communist from ideology, he was professionally anti-whoever his government designated as enemies. He investigated Nazis as readily as communists when the Weimar Republic ordered it. He served the Nazi regime despite not being a Nazi. Why not serve the Soviets if they controlled his fate? Müller demonstrated consistent ability to subordinate personal beliefs, if any, to institutional survival. Working for Soviet intelligence would be another adaptation, another compromise with power. His complete lack of ideological conviction, which made him valuable to the Nazis, would make him potentially valuable to the Soviets as well. The strongest evidence against the Soviet theory is simply the absence of Müller. The Soviets captured hundreds of thousands of Germans in Berlin, processed millions through prisoner of war camps, and maintained meticulous records despite the chaos. Former prisoners, German POWs who returned home in the 1950s, could identify fellow prisoners, describe who was where. Soviet camp records, largely opened after the USSR collapsed, contain no Heinrich Müller. No prisoner remembers seeing him. No guard recalls processing him. No document places him in Soviet custody. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but at some point, the complete lack of any confirming documentation becomes its own kind of evidence. Yet the possibility cannot be entirely dismissed. Intelligence operations specialize in creating absence of evidence, in ensuring deniability, in hiding what must remain hidden. If any organization possessed the capability to make someone completely disappear from the historical record, it was Soviet intelligence. Müller, of all people, would understand this. He spent his career creating absences, making people vanish into the system without trace. If he survived and entered Soviet service, he'd know exactly how to ensure no evidence survived. The Moscow ghost theory remains unproven, likely unprovable, but the absence of proof is not quite the same as proof of absence. Somewhere in Russian archives, perhaps, sit documents that could answer definitively whether the Gestapo chief became a Soviet asset. Until those documents surface, if they exist, the Moscow ghost remains one possible explanation for how Heinrich Müller vanished so completely that 80 years of searching has found nothing at all. May 7th, 1946, Genoa, Italy. A German refugee, papers identifying him as Hermann Fischer, boards a ship departing for Buenos Aires. He carries documentation from the Vatican's refugee assistance program, letters of introduction to the German community in Argentina, and a small amount of cash. Fischer is actually an SS officer fleeing war crimes prosecution, one of hundreds using what will become known as the Rat Lines escape routes, organised by sympathetic clergy, former Nazis, and opportunistic officials who traffic in false documents and passages to South America. Over the next decade, thousands of Nazi war criminals will successfully escape via these routes. Adolf Eichmann reaches Argentina in 1950. Joseph Mengele arrives in Brazil in 1953. Dozens of concentration camp commandants, Gestapo officers, SS leaders, and collaborators find refuge in Latin America. The rat lines prove remarkably effective, moving war criminals across porous post-war borders, through sympathetic way stations to countries that either don't know or don't care about their passengers' pasts. So when Heinrich Müller vanishes, the obvious question becomes, did he use these same rat lines to escape to South America, living quietly somewhere until natural death? The South American escape theory has surface plausibility. Müller possessed intelligence training, understood document forgery, and presumably had access to resources. The rat lines existed and functioned effectively for other senior Nazis. Several reports, beginning in 1946 and continuing through the 1970s, claim Müller sightings in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Western intelligence agencies investigate these reports seriously for years, recognizing that successful escape was possible and that Müller's intelligence background might have enabled exceptional operational security. The theory also explains why Müller's family received no contact. Maintaining absolutely no connection would be essential to avoid detection. Yet every investigation of South American escape theories has failed to produce confirming evidence, and the theory faces serious problems that distinguish Müller's case from successful escapees. The fundamental difference is preparation. Eichmann, Mengele, and others who successfully escaped had advance warning and time to arrange their flights. Eichmann, captured by Americans in 1945, escaped from a detention camp in 1946 and spent 4 years in Germany using false identity before leaving for Argentina in 1950. Mengele left Germany in 1949 after living under aliases for 4 years. These men had years to arrange papers, gather resources, and plan routes. Müller, if he escaped, did so immediately from Berlin's chaos in May 1945. He had no advance preparation visible in any evidence, no documented contact with escape networks, no financial arrangements discovered in investigations. Successful escape required documents, money, contacts, and safe houses through multiple countries. Acquiring all this while besieged in Berlin seems extraordinarily difficult. The Vatican rat lines, operated by clergy like Bishop Alois Hudal and Father Krunoslav Draganovich, maintained records of who they assisted, not complete records, but enough that researchers have identified hundreds of escapees. Müller's name appears nowhere in these fragmentary records. The Odessa Network, a semi-mythical organisation of SS officers helping each other escape, has never been definitively proven to exist as a coordinated entity, though individual SS officers certainly helped each other. Even if Odessa existed, investigators found no evidence Müller was part of it. The contrast with other successful escapees is stark. When Mossad tracked Eichmann, they found documentary traces, border crossings, refugee applications, changed names but findable. Mengele left similarly detectable traces. Müller left none. The sightings themselves follow a pattern that suggests mistake rather than genuine trail. First report, Müller in Munich, 1946, working for a transport company. Investigation reveals the person is Georg Müller, no relation, similar appearance. Second report, Müller in Argentina, 1952, living in Buenos Aires German community. Police investigation finds no such person, witnesses unreliable. Third report, Müller in Brazil, 1968, recognized by former Gestapo officer. The former officer proves to have memory problems and history of making false claims for attention, on and on for 30 years, each sighting investigated, each investigation producing nothing. The pattern suggests that Heinrich Müller has become a phantom, a name people associate with any German of the right age who seems suspicious or secretive. The absence of credible confirmed sightings stands in stark contrast to Eichmann, who maintained contacts with family, received visitors, and was located through patient intelligence work. The Mossad investigation that found Eichmann in Buenos Aires specifically searched for Müller as well. After capturing Eichmann in May 1960, Mossad agents interrogated him about Müller's whereabouts. Eichmann claimed complete ignorance, said he hadn't seen Müller since April 1945 in Berlin, and had no idea if he survived. Mossad investigators, based in Buenos Aires, with time and resources, examined the German community thoroughly. They found no trace of Müller, no whispers of his presence, no indication he'd ever been in Argentina. If Müller had escaped to South America and lived there from 1945 to 1960, 15 years, surely someone would have recognized him. Some trace would have surfaced. The German exile community wasn't that large. People talked, yet nothing. Financial evidence argues against successful escape as well. Other escaped Nazis often accessed hidden assets, bank accounts in neutral countries, looted valuables, gold. Investigators found no evidence Müller ever accessed any foreign bank accounts after 1945. Sophie Müller, his wife, lived in poverty post-war, receiving minor widow's pension and charity. If Heinrich had access to hidden funds, he could have arranged anonymous transfers to provide for his family without revealing his location. He never did. This could indicate exceptional operational security, maintaining no contact, even financial, to avoid detection. Or it could indicate death, removing any possibility of support. The complete financial abandonment argues more for death than escape. The psychological profile developed by analysts examining Müller's personality also creates doubts about South American escape. Men who successfully lived underground in South America typically maintained some human connections. Mengele communicated with family, Eichmann worked and had local friends, others integrated into German communities. Müller's entire documented life shows someone incapable of forming human bonds, someone who treated all relationships transactionally. Could such a man successfully build a new identity requiring interaction with communities, creating plausible backstory, maintaining cover identity for decades? Perhaps. But it seems contrary to his nature. Müller excelled at institutional roles where clear hierarchies and defined procedures structured everything. Living underground requires improvisation, flexibility, social skills, and tolerance for ambiguity. None of these characterized Müller's documented behavior. Simon Wiesenthal, the famed Nazi hunter, devoted enormous resources to finding Müller throughout the 1960s. His organization investigated every reported sighting, maintained informants in German communities across South America, and offered rewards for information. Wiesenthal's memoir describes Müller as the one who got away, but he ultimately concluded that Müller most likely died in Berlin. The conclusion came reluctantly, after hundreds of man-hours investigating leads, after spending money and political capital on searches that went nowhere. Wiesenthal understood the rat lines better than almost anyone. His organization tracked dozens of successful escapees. His eventual conclusion that Müller didn't use them carries significant weight precisely because he so desperately wanted to find Müller alive and bring him to justice. The last serious investigation of a possible South American Müller sighting occurred in 1971 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. An informant contacted West German authorities claiming a man calling himself Heinrich Müller, living in Sao Paulo's German district, was actually the former Gestapo chief. CIA and BND, West German intelligence, jointly investigated. They located Heinrich Müller, put him under surveillance, eventually approached him. He was indeed a German immigrant of the right age. He was also definitely not Heinrich Müller, wrong hometown, different service record, no intelligence background. Investigators concluded the name similarity and age had triggered false identification. After this final fiasco, Western intelligence agencies effectively closed their active Müller searches, filing the case as presumed dead, whereabouts unknown. The rat line theory's appeal lies in its plausibility. Other Nazis escaped successfully, why not Müller? But plausibility requires evidence, and evidence is precisely what's missing. No documents, no credible sightings, no financial traces, no contacts with family, no integration into exile communities where successful escapees typically surfaced. The complete absence of any confirming evidence, despite decades of searching by motivated intelligence services, suggests the theory is wrong. Müller either died in Berlin or ended somewhere even more hidden than South American exile. The rat-line phantom, like the Moscow ghost, remains a possibility that cannot be entirely excluded. But the weight of negative evidence, the absence of what should be present if the theory were true, pushes even determined investigators toward alternative explanations. Sometimes the most obvious answer that Müller died anonymously in Berlin's chaos proves to be correct, despite its unsatisfying lack of drama or closure. May 3rd, 1945, Berlin Mitte District. A cemetery worker named Joseph Amann picks his way through the Jewish cemetery on Grosse Hamburger Straße, counting bodies awaiting burial. Soviet bombardment has finally stopped after days of continuous shelling, and the terrible work of dealing with the dead can begin. Berlin contains approximately 125,000 civilian corpses, victims of artillery, bombs, street fighting, suicide, execution, starvation, and disease. The identification system has completely collapsed. Documents burned, witnesses dead, families scattered, normal procedures impossible. Amann and other cemetery workers receive bodies with minimal information, approximate age, location found, sometimes a name if someone knew the deceased. Many arrive simply as unidentified male or unidentified female. The cemetery quickly fills with graves marked with whatever information exists, often just dates and question marks. Among the graves Amann helps dig is one marked Heinrich Müller, born 1900, died May 1945. He doesn't remember anything special about this particular body. It was one of dozens that week. The name was common. The marking seemed routine. Then the grave sits undisturbed for 18 years. The possibility that Heinrich Müller died anonymously in Berlin's final chaos is, statistically and logically, the most likely explanation for his disappearance. The scale of death and destruction makes this not only possible but probable. Berlin, in late April and early May 1945, experiences casualties at a rate comparable to major historical disasters, earthquakes, plagues, tsunamis. Approximately 25,000 German soldiers and civilians die in the final week of fighting. Thousands more commit suicide in the days immediately following surrender. Bodies lie in rubble, floating canals, are buried in collapsed buildings. The Soviet advance is brutal, summary executions are common, and chaos reigns. An individual SS officer, even a senior one, could easily die without identification, killed by artillery, shot by Soviet soldiers, murdered by German resistance for being Nazi, or taking his own life. The body might never be found, or found but unidentifiable, or buried with incorrect information. The grave marked with Müller's name comes to official attention in 1963 when West German prosecutors preparing potential war crimes cases systematically review Berlin cemetery records. The Jewish cemetery on Grosse Hamburger Straße provides its burial lists from 1945, and one entry jumps out. Heinrich Müller, born 1900. The birth year matches the Gestapo chief exactly. The death is listed as May 1945, consistent with the timeline of Berlin's fall. The cemetery's location is relatively close to the government quarter where Müller was last seen. The prosecutors, understanding this could be the most important find in decades of Nazi hunting, petition for exhumation. Permission is granted by both civil authorities and the Jewish community that owns the cemetery. In June 1963, investigators carefully excavate the grave. What they find is both intriguing and inconclusive. The remains are of a male, approximately the right age, based on bone development and dental wear. The skeleton shows no obvious cause of death, no bullet damage to skull or ribs, no signs of severe trauma. The man was of medium height, consistent with Müller's recorded dimensions, but not definitively confirming. No personal effects survived with the body, no uniform remnants, no documents, no jewellery. The burial was hasty and shallow, typical of mass burials in May 1945. The forensic team takes measurements, photographs, and attempts dental identification. But here, the investigation encounters a fundamental problem. Comprehensive. Dental records for Heinrich Müller don't exist. The Gestapo didn't maintain detailed medical files on its own personnel with the same thoroughness it documented victims. Comparison becomes impossible. Forensic anthropology in 1963 has significant limitations compared to modern techniques. Age estimation from skeletal remains can be accurate to within 10 or 15 years, but rarely more precise. The skull analysis suggests a man in his 40s, possibly early 50s. Heinrich Müller would have been 63 in May 1945. The discrepancy is notable but not definitive. Age estimation errors of 10 to 15 years are possible. Bone development varies individually, and wartime malnutrition can affect aging indicators. The height estimation, approximately 170 centimetres, about 5 feet 7 inches, matches Müller's recorded height within normal measurement error. The investigators conduct extensive analysis and conclude, possibly, Heinrich Müller, not definitively confirmed, not definitively excluded. The report is filed, the body reburied, and the case remains open. The question of how a body ended up in a grave marked with Müller's name, if it isn't actually Müller, presents its own mystery. Several explanations are possible. First coincidence. Heinrich Müller was an extraordinarily common name in Germany, the equivalent of John Smith in America. Perhaps another Heinrich Müller, born 1900, died in Berlin in May 1945 and was buried here. His identity was known to someone who arranged the grave marker, and the coincidence with the Gestapo chief is just that unfortunate coincidence. Second, deliberate misdirection. Someone in 1945, knowing Müller disappeared, marked an unknown body with his name to create false trail or confusion. This seems elaborate for chaotic times, but intelligence, tradecraft includes such deceptions. Third, partial accuracy. Heinrich Müller did die in Berlin and was buried hastily, but cemetery workers confused him with another body, marking the wrong grave with his name, while Müller lies elsewhere unidentified. The scale of unidentified dead in Berlin makes the third possibility disturbingly plausible. Modern researchers estimate that of approximately 125,000 Berlin civilian dead from the battle and its immediate aftermath, roughly 40,000 remain unidentified today. These include bodies never recovered from rubble, mass graves without individual markers, and individual graves marked only as unknown. The Soviet forces and German survivors conducting burials in May and June 1945 worked under terrible conditions, disease, shortage of supplies, psychological trauma, urgency to clear streets of decomposing bodies. Mistakes were inevitable. Bodies were mixed up, identifications confused, records created from rumour rather than confirmation. Heinrich Müller's corpse could be in any of thousands of graves marked unidentified male, age approximate 50 to 60, May 1945. The pattern of suicide among senior Nazi officials adds another dimension to the death in Berlin theory. Hitler committed suicide April 30th. Goebbels and his wife killed themselves and their children May 1st. Himmler took cyanide in British custody May 23rd. Goering poisoned himself hours before scheduled execution in October 1946. Robert Ley, Gestapo official, hanged himself in Nuremberg cell. Hans Frank, Governor-General of occupied Poland, attempted suicide. The list continues. Senior Nazis faced with capture and certain execution often chose suicide instead. Müller, understanding better than most what awaited him if captured, war crimes, trial, public humiliation, execution, might have made the same choice. A single gunshot in the chaos of May 1st or 2nd, body falling into rubble, no witness to report it, corpse eventually found and buried anonymously. This scenario requires no elaborate escape plans, no conspiracy, no mysterious survival. Just the same end chosen by many of his colleagues, with the particular tragedy of being lost among so many dead that his death went unrecorded. Physical evidence from Berlin adds to the death theory's plausibility. The government quarter, where Müller was last seen, suffered extraordinarily heavy damage. Soviet artillery specifically targeted this area, understanding it contained Nazi leadership. Building after building collapsed, streets were cratered, entire blocks burned. Post-war reconstruction demolished many damaged structures. Rubble was cleared without systematic searching, and any bodies trapped in collapsed buildings were often never recovered. If Müller died in the government quarter on April 30th or May 1st, killed by artillery, shot in street fighting, or executing himself in a damaged building, his body could easily have been buried in rubble. Survivors and Soviet forces had more pressing concerns than carefully excavating collapsed structures looking for bodies. Thousands of corpses were simply left where they fell, eventually covered by demolition and reconstruction. The counterargument against death in Berlin focuses on Müller's preparation and capabilities. This was not an ordinary man caught by circumstances. This was one of the most capable intelligence officers in the world. Someone who spent his career making other people disappear. Someone who understood operational security better than almost anyone. The civilian clothes under his SS uniform suggest preparation. The selective file preservation suggests planning. Would such a man simply die randomly in chaos? Or would he have arranged something more controlled? The argument has weight but assumes Müller's planning succeeded. Even capable people die in wars. Even intelligence officers get caught by artillery or shot by soldiers who don't recognize them. Capability doesn't guarantee survival, especially in conditions as chaotic as Berlin in May 1945. 50 years pass before technology advances enough to potentially solve the grave mystery definitively. In 2013, Berlin authorities, prompted by renewed public interest and the availability of DNA testing, decide to exhume the grave-marked Heinrich Müller once more. This time, forensic geneticists can extract DNA from the bones and compare it to samples from confirmed Müller family descendants. One of Müller's daughters, now in her 70s, provides a DNA sample. The comparison testing takes several months. The results announced in late 2013 are unambiguous. The body in the grave is not Heinrich Müller. The DNA shows no familial relationship to the Müller descendants. The mystery of who the person in the grave actually was remains unsolved. Possibly another Heinrich Müller, possibly someone else entirely, possibly a cemetery worker killed during Soviet assault, but definitively not the Gestapo chief. The DNA exclusion should have provided closure, at least ruling out one possibility. Instead, it deepened the mystery. If Müller died in Berlin, where is his body? The Jewish cemetery grave was the only marked location bearing his name. Systematic searches of cemetery records find no other Heinrich Müller burials from the right time frame. The mass graves, and Berlin has several containing thousands of unidentified remains, offer no practical way to search for one specific individual. Modern forensic techniques could potentially identify Müller if they had remains to test. But finding those remains among 40,000 unidentified dead from a battle 80 years ago approaches impossibility. The anonymous grave theory remains viable. Müller died in Berlin, lies buried somewhere in the city, but the specific location will never be known. Of all the unsatisfying conclusions to his story, this may be the most historically probable and the least emotionally satisfying. June 10th, 1945, Charlottenburg District, Berlin. American interrogators arrive at the Müller family apartment for the third time, hoping that persistence will reveal what previous interviews missed. Sophie Müller, 42 years old, sits in the same chair where she sat during earlier interrogations by American, British, and Soviet officers. Her 4 children, ages ranging from 9 to 17, wait in the adjacent room, having been interviewed separately to check for consistency. The apartment is modest, damaged by bombing but habitable, and shows no evidence of wealth or preparation for extended survival. The interrogators search again, checking for hidden compartments, documents, money, anything that might indicate where Heinrich Müller went. They find nothing. Sophie's story remains identical to previous interviews. Her husband visited briefly on April 20th, seemed preoccupied but gave no plain indication of farewell, made no arrangements for the family's future, and never contacted them again. She has received no money, no messages, no instructions. The interrogators leave, adding another report to the growing file that suggests either Sophie genuinely knows nothing or she maintains the most perfect operational security ever witnessed. The testimony and experience of Heinrich Müller's family provides crucial evidence for understanding his fate, yet this evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. On one hand, the family's complete abandonment, financial, emotional, practical, suggests either Müller's death or such extreme operational security that he severed all family ties permanently. On the other hand, intelligence training emphasizes that family connections are exploitable vulnerabilities, and Müller would understand this better than most. The question becomes, was the abandonment proof of death or proof of professional discipline? 40 years of observation, multiple interviews by different agencies and journalists, and the family's consistent behaviour suggest genuine abandonment rather than elaborate cover story, but certainty remains elusive. Sophie Müller's post-war life provides strong evidence for the death theory. She receives no financial support from any source that might represent hidden assets or a living husband. Her poverty is real and documented. She applies for widow's pension in 1946, declaring Heinrich dead based on his disappearance. She lives in reduced circumstances, takes in sewing work to supplement meagre pension, and struggles to feed 4 children. If Heinrich survived with access to the resources necessary to escape money, documents, contacts, why would he leave his family destitute? Other Nazi officials who escaped typically made some provision for families, even if indirectly through intermediaries. Eichmann, hiding in Austria for years before leaving for Argentina, maintained covert contact with his wife, eventually arranging for her and their sons to join him. Mengele sent money to family in Germany from South America. The complete absence of any support for Sophie and the children argues powerfully for Heinrich's inability to provide support either through death or capture. The children's testimony across decades remains remarkably consistent, which supports authenticity. The oldest daughter, Gudrun, interviewed multiple times between 1945 and the 1980s, maintains she remembers her father as distant, emotionally unavailable, preoccupied with work. His April 20th visit was brief and unremarkable. He showed no unusual behaviour, gave no indication of farewell or crisis. She remembers him leaving and never returning, and her mother's increasing worry as days passed without word. The younger children remember even less a vague figure who worked constantly, rarely engaged with them, and then wasn't there anymore. None show signs of coaching or maintaining cover stories. Their memories are sparse, emotionally flat, and consistent, exactly what one would expect from children whose father was killed or disappeared without explanation. Psychological evaluation of the children as adults suggests genuine abandonment trauma rather than maintained deception. Several children changed their names as adults, seeking to escape association with their father's crimes. One daughter completely severed all contact with remaining family, refusing to discuss her background with her own children. The oldest son struggled with depression and substance abuse, common in children of absent fathers. These patterns match documented effects of parental abandonment and differ from what psychologists would expect if the family maintained contact with a father living in hiding. Maintaining such deception for decades would require extraordinary family discipline and would likely produce different psychological patterns: anxiety about discovery, guilt about lying, or pride in protecting the fugitive. The Müller children show none of these patterns. The interrogators who interviewed Sophie noted her emotional responses and found them convincing. She displayed appropriate worry about her missing husband initially, then gradually shifted to resigned acceptance of widowhood. Her grief seemed genuine, not performed for interrogators. She cooperated fully with searches of the apartment, answered questions without evasion, and showed none of the micro-expressions or behavioural tells that trained interrogators look for in deception. One American CIC officer's report notes, "Subject appears genuinely ignorant of husband's fate. Her emotional responses are consistent with abandonment or loss. No indication of maintained contact or knowledge of whereabouts." Similar assessments appear in British and Soviet interrogation reports. Professional interrogators from 3 different intelligence services all concluded Sophie was telling the truth. The absence of any financial transactions provides strong supporting evidence. Post-war investigators examined bank records, property transfers, any movements of money that might indicate hidden assets supporting the family. They found nothing. All Müller family accounts were frozen or empty. No unexplained money appeared in Sophie's accounts. She made no large purchases, no investments, no financial moves suggesting access to hidden funds. If Heinrich survived and had access to looted assets or hidden accounts common among senior Nazis, he either chose not to support his family or couldn't risk transactions that might reveal his survival. Either interpretation is possible, but the former seems extraordinarily callous even by Müller's standards, while the latter seems almost paranoid, surely small. Untraceable payments through intermediaries would be possible if he were alive and concerned about his family's welfare. Compare this to other Nazi families where the official escaped. Mengeler's family in Günzburg, Germany, maintained contact and received money. His wife remarried, but knew Joseph lived. Eichmann's wife eventually joined him in Argentina. Priebke's family knew his location. The pattern suggests that even fugitive Nazis maintained some family connection. The complete severance between Heinrich Müller and his family is anomalous. It suggests either death, capture by authorities who prevented contact, or such extreme commitment to operational security that even family became expendable. The first explanation seems most likely given human nature and the pattern established by other cases. Sophie died in 1983, aged 80, never having changed her testimony. In nearly 40 years of widowhood, she gave no indication of knowing more than she told interrogators in 1945. She could have profited from her story, journalists offered money for exclusive interviews, publishers wanted memoirs of life with the Gestapo chief, but she consistently refused. She lived quietly, avoided publicity, and maintained her simple story. Her husband disappeared in April 1945. She never heard from him again. She assumed he died in Berlin's chaos. On her deathbed, attended by her children, she said nothing to suggest she'd maintained a 40-year deception. The burden of proof should rest on those claiming she lied consistently for 4 decades rather than on those who believe her testimony. The Müller children, now elderly themselves, have consistently refused media requests for interviews in recent decades. They want no association with their father's crimes, no public attention to their family history. This desire for anonymity seems incompatible with maintaining an elaborate deception about their father's survival. People who protect fugitives typically eventually tell the story, seeking vindication, historical record, or simply the need to unburden themselves. The Müller children have done none of these things. They've sought obscurity, changed names, and avoided any discussion of their father. Their behaviour matches people genuinely abandoned by a parent who either died or chose to sever all family ties completely. It doesn't match people protecting a father's secret survival. The family testimony ultimately supports the conclusion that Heinrich Müller either died in Berlin or achieved such complete disappearance that even his wife and children were cut off permanently. Neither option is fully satisfying. Death provides closure but lacks confirmation. Complete severance from family suggests survival but raises questions about how any person, however disciplined, maintains such absolute isolation for decades. Perhaps the answer is simpler than elaborate theories suggest. Müller died anonymously in Berlin's chaos, his body never identified, his family left to cope with uncertainty. The widow and orphans he created numbered in the millions. Jewish families, resistance. Families murdered civilians across Europe. That his own family suffered a milder version of the same loss has tragic symmetry. They were abandoned by the man who abandoned so many others to death, and they lived the rest of their lives with the same unanswered questions he created for millions of victims. The difference is that his victims deserved answers, deserved justice, deserved closure. Heinrich Müller's family inherited the consequences of his crimes without committing them. One more category of collateral damage from a man whose entire career produced nothing but suffering. August 15th, 1944. Gestapo headquarters, Berlin. A subordinate officer enters Heinrich Müller's office at 8 in the morning with urgent reports from Paris. The French resistance has intensified sabotage operations. Allied armies approach the city, and the local Gestapo commander requests guidance. Müller listens without expression, asks 3 precise questions about remaining German forces in the Paris region, and issues concise orders: evacuate essential personnel, destroy sensitive files, execute high-value prisoners who cannot be transported, abandon the rest. The subordinate notes that Müller's tone is identical to yesterday's conversation about vacation schedules for secretarial staff: calm, matter-free, precise. He shows no anger about losing Paris, no enthusiasm for the executions, no concern about retreating forces. The officer has worked for Müller for 3 years and cannot recall ever seeing him display emotion. Not rage, not fear, not joy, not grief. Nothing. He processes information, makes decisions, issues orders, and his face remains a mask, showing nothing beneath. The subordinate leaves the office disturbed, not for the first time, by the question, Is there anything human behind that mask? Or is Müller simply a machine that happens to occupy human form? Understanding Heinrich Müller's disappearance requires understanding his unique psychology, a personality structure so devoid of normal human emotional response that he could process industrialized murder with the same affect as routine paperwork. Modern psychologists, analyzing documented testimony about Müller's behavior, consistently identify patterns suggesting severe schizoid personality disorder, or possibly something even more unusual, a complete absence of emotional empathy combined with intact cognitive and social functioning. This isn't psychopathy as typically understood, which involves impulsivity and thrill-seeking. Müller was meticulous and careful. It's not sadism, he showed no pleasure in others' suffering. It's something rarer and more disturbing, complete emotional flatness, combined with unlimited capacity for compartmentalization and adaptation. The testimony about Müller's personal behavior from colleagues, subordinates, and victims is remarkably consistent across sources. Eichmann, interrogated in Israel, described Müller as like a machine, completely self-contained, impossible to read. A secretary who worked for him for 2 years said she never saw him laugh, never saw him raise his voice in anger, never saw any expression cross his face except focused attention. A British SOE agent he interrogated for 18 hours straight described him as eerily calm, as if he could continue forever without fatigue or emotional investment in the outcome. Resistance members who survived Gestapo interrogation by other officers described beatings, rage, sadism, human evil, but recognizably human. Those interrogated by Müller described something different: patient, methodical questioning, psychological manipulation, exhaustion techniques, but no emotional content whatsoever. His domestic life reinforces this picture of emotional absence. Neighbours in the Charlottenburg apartment building described Müller as correct but cold. He greeted people appropriately, maintained his property, caused no problems, but formed no friendships or social connections. He never attended building social events, never engaged in casual conversation beyond formal pleasantries. Sophie's testimony, despite her loyalty as a wife, describes an emotionally distant marriage. Heinrich worked, came home late, rarely spoke about his day, showed no interest in her activities, interacted minimally with children. He provided financially, fulfilled conventional obligations, but Sophie describes feeling like she lived with a stranger who happened to share her apartment. This wasn't abuse in traditional sense. He wasn't cruel or violent at home. He was simply absent, emotionally unreachable, performing the role of husband and father without any apparent inner content. The complete lack of hobbies, interests, or pursuits beyond work is striking. Most people, even obsessive workers, have some outside interest: sports, reading, music, collecting, something. Müller had nothing. He worked, he slept, he ate, he worked more. Subordinates who travelled with him on official business described him as bringing work everywhere, reading reports on trains, never sightseeing or taking opportunities for leisure. He didn't drink socially, didn't pursue women despite opportunities for affairs common among Nazi officials, didn't gamble, didn't seek entertainment. He simply worked. When asked by a colleague why he never took vacations, Müller reportedly said, "What would I do?" The question seemed genuine, not rhetorical. He apparently couldn't conceive of activities that weren't work. This personality structure explains certain puzzling aspects of his career. His lack of ideological commitment wasn't rebelliousness or secret opposition, it was genuine inability to care about abstract ideas. He investigated Nazis and communists with equal thoroughness because neither group meant anything to him emotionally. They were just categories of targets. His service to the Nazi regime wasn't driven by hatred of Jews or political enemies. It was service to institutional structure. The organization gave orders, he executed them efficiently. He could sign death warrants for thousands without emotional response because the victims weren't real to him as human beings. They were data problems to process, administrative challenges. This isn't to excuse his crimes. His actions were horrific regardless of psychological state, but understanding his psychology helps explain how he functioned so efficiently in a role that destroyed others psychologically. Modern psychological assessment suggests Müller might have been incapable of forming genuine human attachments. Attachment theory describes how people bond emotionally to others. Most people, even criminals and killers, form selective attachments to family, friends, colleagues, ideology, nation, something. Müller appears to have formed no attachments whatsoever. He wasn't loyal to Heydrich as a person, only to the institutional structure Heydrich represented. He showed no grief at Heydrich's death. He wasn't loyal to Hitler, he never expressed reverence for the Führer or regret at the regime's collapse. He wasn't loyal to Germany as a nation, he'd apparently have served any government with equal efficiency. He wasn't loyal to his family, he abandoned them without visible remorse. What then did motivate him? Perhaps only the task itself, the intellectual challenge of processing information and solving problems efficiently, work as end in itself, divorced from meaning or purpose, beyond the immediate technical challenge. This psychological profile becomes crucial when considering his disappearance. Would a man incapable of normal human attachments feel any obligation to contact family, provide for their future, or maintain connections? No. Would he feel guilt about abandoning them? No. Would he hesitate to shed his identity entirely if circumstances required it? No. A person with normal emotional responses might struggle with such complete transformation, the loss of identity, the severance from all known relationships, the psychological burden of becoming someone else. Müller, if he survived, would face no such struggle. He had no real identity to lose, no meaningful relationships to mourn. He could walk away from Heinrich Müller as easily as discarding a worn suit, assuming new identity without psychological stress, because he'd never had authentic personal identity to begin with. He'd been performing roles his entire life: student, soldier, policeman, Gestapo, chief, none of them reflecting genuine inner self, because there was no inner self. Only the functional intelligence processing information and adapting to circumstances. The question becomes whether someone so psychologically unusual could successfully survive underground. Arguments cut both directions. On one hand, Müller lacked social skills that typically help people integrate into new communities, create plausible cover stories, and form relationships that provide support and cover. On the other hand, his complete lack of emotional ties meant he had nothing to give him away. No longing for family, no desire for recognition, no need to tell his story. Men caught after years in hiding often betray themselves through human weaknesses. Contacting family, seeking validation, taking unnecessary risks driven by emotion. Müller had none of these weaknesses. If he survived, he would be the perfect fugitive, someone with absolutely no reason to surface, no psychological need for connection or recognition, capable of living entirely within whatever new identity he constructed without nostalgia for the past. Yet this same psychology suggests death might be more likely than escape. Müller's entire existence was defined by institutional role. Remove the institution, remove the clear hierarchies and procedures and defined objectives, and what remains? A person who never developed independent identity, who never formed human connections, who never pursued interests beyond work assignments. What would such a person do in hiding? How would he fill days, find purpose, create meaning? Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps removing the institutional framework that gave his existence structure would leave him incapable of functioning. The chaos of Berlin's collapse didn't just threaten his physical survival, it destroyed the only framework in which his personality could operate. Suicide, in such circumstances, might have seemed not desperate but logical. The recognition that without institutional role, there was nothing to preserve. The psychology of Heinrich Müller, whether he survived or died, presents one of history's most disturbing portraits of human capability. He was brilliant, achieving extraordinary effectiveness in complex organizational roles. He was utterly without empathy, processing mass murder with the emotional engagement most people bring to filing taxes. He was adaptable, serving different masters and ideologies with equal efficiency. He was empty, a person-shaped void that had learned to mimic human behavior without experiencing human feelings. Whether such a person deserves understanding or only condemnation remains debated, but understanding his psychology is essential to grasping how the Holocaust happened. Systems of industrialized murder require designers and ideologues, yes, But they also require implementers, people who can transform evil ideas into working reality without psychological collapse, who can sign death warrants without remorse, who can process human suffering as administrative data. Heinrich Müller was the perfect implementer, and his psychology explains both his terrible effectiveness and the mystery of his disappearance. He was the ghost who created ghosts, the empty man who manufactured absence, and when his empire collapsed, he himself became absence. Perhaps that's fitting, the man who made millions disappear, finally disappearing himself, leaving only questions and the terrible documentation of what he did when he was here. February 8th, 1945, Gestapo headquarters, Berlin. Heinrich Müller calls his deputy chiefs to a meeting and issues unusual instructions. Certain files he provides a specific list are to be duplicated immediately. Original copies will be evacuated to Bavaria per standard procedures, but duplicate copies are to be prepared in smaller format, portable, and stored in locations he designates privately to each deputy. The files concern Western intelligence networks, compromised Allied agents, Soviet spy operations in Germany, and what Müller calls sensitive political intelligence, presumably compromising information about German officials, foreign contacts, anything that might have value as leverage or currency. Several deputies find the instruction odd enough to mention it in post-war testimony. Standard procedure called for either preserving files or destroying them, duplicating selected intelligence for personal storage outside normal chains of custody, suggested Müller was preparing insurance assets he could control independently of institutional protocols. What he intended to do with this insurance remains unknown. But the preparation itself indicates Müller was thinking beyond the Reich's defeat, considering futures where intelligence might be his only valuable commodity. The final months of Heinrich Müller's documented life reveal a man simultaneously fulfilling duties to a dying regime while methodically preparing for an uncertain future. He maintained his usual operational routines, processing reports, coordinating security operations, conducting interrogations, even as these activities lost practical meaning. But overlaid on this routine were unusual actions suggesting preparation, contingency planning, or the creation of assets that might prove useful in whatever came next. Understanding these final operations is crucial to evaluating whether Müller's disappearance was planned or improvised, whether he had resources to escape, and whether he might have survived. January 1945 brings systematic evacuation of RSHA files from Berlin to southern Germany and Austria. This wasn't unusual. Many government agencies evacuated documents as Allied armies approached. But the selection of what to evacuate reveals Müller's priorities. He ordered preservation of operational intelligence agent networks, informant lists, compromised enemy personnel while allowing destruction of administrative records and routine reports. Post-war investigators found that files about Holocaust operations, deportation records, and genocide documentation were largely destroyed in these final months. While intelligence files about foreign networks were carefully preserved, this selective preservation suggests Müller understood these latter files had potential future value, while genocide documentation was only liability. More unusual were the orders some subordinates received regarding civilian documentation. Several Gestapo officers later testified that in late January and February, Müller instructed them to obtain false identity papers for operational purposes. The papers were high-quality forgeries, complete with appropriate stamps and registrations in names of real but deceased civilians. Müller's office had access to civil registries and could create essentially undetectable false identities. How many such documents were prepared, in whose names, and for what ultimate purpose remains unknown. Some subordinates assumed these were escape documents for Gestapo officers, anticipating Allied capture. But Müller's personal involvement in ordering their creation suggests he might have been preparing his own options. The mysterious meetings of Müller's final weeks provide tantalizing clues. Multiple witnesses, secretaries, junior officers, headquarters guards report seeing unfamiliar civilians visiting Müller's office in March and April. These weren't the usual parade of SS officers, military liaisons, or government officials that normally constituted Gestapo headquarters visitors. They were men in civilian clothes, middle-aged, well-dressed, arriving individually, staying for 30 to 60 minutes, leaving without going through normal sign-in procedures. No records document who they were or what they discussed. Several witnesses noted that Müller seemed to be conducting these meetings personally, rather than delegating to subordinates, unusual for someone normally punctilious about hierarchical procedures. Speculation about these visitors ranges from foreign intelligence contacts to escape facilitators to simply old informants. Müller was personally debriefing, but the meeting's secretive nature and lack of documentation suggest they concerned matters. Müller wanted no official record of the handling of confiscated assets provides another suggestive detail. The RSHA controlled vast quantities of property confiscated from Jews and other victims: cash, jewellery, gold, artwork and valuables. Most of this went to official Reich institutions, but opportunities for personal enrichment existed, and many Nazi officials exploited them. Evidence about Müller's access to such assets is contradictory. His family's post-war poverty suggests he didn't accumulate significant portable wealth. But several witnesses testified about seeing Müller's staff packing small but heavy boxes in March 1945, which they speculated contained gold or valuables. Whether these were for official evacuation, personal insurance, or something else remains unknown. The complete absence of any hidden Müller assets surfacing after the war argues against substantial personal enrichment, but the possibility exists that he had access to portable wealth if he chose to use it. April brings the final documented directive bearing Müller's signature. Dated April 28th, one day before his disappearance, the order concerns preservation of intelligence assets for future state security operations. The language is bureaucratic, but the implications are strange. What future state security operations? By April 28th, everyone knew the Reich would collapse within days. What future state would employ RSHA intelligence assets? The order could be simple bureaucratic inertia, Müller continuing to issue standard directives even when meaningless, or it could be coded instruction to subordinates about preserving assets for some post-Reich purpose. The document is preserved in Soviet archives, but the subordinates who received it were never located for testimony about what it actually meant, or what actions they took in response. The relationship between Müller's final operations and potential escape plans remains frustratingly unclear. Evidence suggests preparation, duplicate files, false documents, mysterious visitors, selective asset preservation. But evidence also shows continued routine operations, normal work schedule, standard orders, no detected communication with escape networks like Odessa. Reconciling these patterns requires understanding Müller's psychology and methodology. He was a man who prepared for contingencies without committing to specific courses of action. He created options while maintaining plausible deniability. He would arrange potential escape routes while continuing normal work that would provide cover if those routes proved unnecessary. This is exactly how a professional intelligence officer operates. Multiple options, maintained parallel, final decisions, delayed until circumstances force choice. The most intriguing testimony comes from Müller's personal secretary, who survived the war and was extensively interrogated. She described Müller in the final weeks as focused on organisation rather than emotion. He sorted files meticulously, burned some personally rather than delegating destruction, packed others carefully in small portable containers. He worked through a checklist she couldn't see, ticking off items with satisfaction when completed. He showed no visible distress about the Reich's collapse, no panic about his future. He processed the end of Nazi Germany with the same methodical attention he'd brought to every other task. The secretary's impression was that Müller had prepared for this eventuality, or at least prepared to adapt to whatever occurred. Whether those preparations succeeded, or whether chaos overwhelmed, even his careful planning remains history's unanswered question. The last confirmed sighting of Heinrich Müller in operational context comes on April 28th, approximately 36 hours before his disappearance. He conducted a final staff meeting, reviewed intelligence reports about Soviet forces' positions, issued orders for continued counterintelligence operations that everyone knew were now pointless. He dismissed subordinates with no farewell, no acknowledgement that this might be the last time they'd meet. He returned to his office and worked into the evening. Witnesses saw lights in his office until late midnight or after. What he was doing in those final hours, destroying evidence, preparing documents, sitting alone, contemplating his situation, or simply processing paperwork from habit no one knows. The next morning, April 29th, he appeared in the bunker complex for the last time, wearing civilian clothes under his uniform, telling the duty officer he'd checked defensive positions, walking into the chaos and never returning. His final operations ended not with dramatic escape or confirmed death, but with characteristic Müller ambiguity preparation that might have enabled survival or might have been futile, planning that either succeeded perfectly or failed completely, leaving no trace either way to confirm what actually happened. September 19th, 1991, Moscow. American historian Robert Gellatly enters the Russian state archives for the first time since the Soviet Union's collapse opened formally classified collections to Western researchers. His research focuses on Nazi security services, and the first name on his document request list is Heinrich Müller. Archive administrators bring him folders from the NKVD's special files on Nazi war criminals. Gellatly opens the first folder marked Special Object M. Heinrich Müller, Gestapo Chief, and begins reading. The file contains approximately 300 pages of documents from 1945 to 1950 interrogation transcripts from hundreds of German prisoners asked about Müller, NKVD search reports, analytical memos, and directive from Beria himself demanding priority effort to locate the Gestapo chief. Gellatly reads carefully, taking notes, until he reaches page 147, where a document begins with Subject, Location and Status of HM, followed by 3 pages that are entirely redacted. Black bars cover every line. He checks the classification marking, still restricted, released date, not determined. Every subsequent document that appears to discuss actual findings rather than search efforts is similarly redacted. The archive contains extensive documentation that the NKVD sought Müller intensively, but what they found, if anything, remains classified 70 years later. Soviet intelligence archives, opened gradually since 1991, provide tantalizing glimpses into the search for Heinrich Müller, while simultaneously deepening the mystery through strategic redactions and unexplained gaps. The documents confirm what was suspected. Finding the Gestapo chief was a top priority for Soviet intelligence, ordered directly by Stalin through Beria. The resources devoted to the search were substantial. But whether the search succeeded, and if so, what became of Müller, remains obscured by classification decisions that seem increasingly difficult to justify as decades pass. The KGB files offer both evidence and its deliberate absence, creating frustration for historians seeking definitive answers. The earliest documents in the Soviet Müller file date from May 2nd, 1945, the day Berlin surrendered. NKVD operational directives list priority targets for capture, and Heinrich Müller appears in the top 5 alongside Hitler, Bormann, Goebbels, and Göring. The directive specifies alive if possible notable, because most Nazi wanted posters simply offered rewards for capture or death. The preference for capturing Müller alive indicates Soviet understanding of his intelligence value. A dead Gestapo chief provides propaganda and closure. A living, interrogatable Gestapo chief provides intelligence about Western networks, resistance penetrations, and potentially compromising information about Allied intelligence services. The directive also specifies that Müller's capture should be reported immediately through special channels, rather than standard military communications indicating the operation's sensitivity. Smersh counterintelligence units, the name means death to spies, received specific orders to search for Müller. Multiple units combed through the government quarter, interrogated German prisoners, and followed any reported sightings. The search reports from May and June 1945 document extraordinary effort. Teams searched Gestapo headquarters thoroughly, interviewing neighbours about Müller's movements. They located and interrogated his wife and children, his secretary, his chauffeur, his immediate subordinates. They searched his office, his apartment, his known associates' locations. They followed up over 200 reported sightings across Berlin and occupied eastern Germany. Every lead ended the same way. Last seen April 29th or 30th. No confirmed activity after whereabouts unknown. The reports show increasing frustration, particularly as weeks passed without success. The interrogation transcripts reveal the thoroughness of Soviet efforts. Over 300 German prisoners ranging from senior SS officers to low-level Gestapo clerks to random Wehrmacht soldiers who happened to be in Berlin during the final days were specifically questioned about Müller. The interrogations followed standard NKVD methodology: multiple sessions, cross-referencing testimony, looking for inconsistencies. Prisoners were asked when they last saw Müller, what he said, what he was wearing, who he was with, what his mental state seemed to be. The transcripts are repetitive, producing the same information again and again. Müller was seen around the bunker complex through April 29th, wearing civilian clothes under uniform, calm and focused, then vanished. Several prisoners speculated about escape or suicide, but none could provide concrete information. Berier's personal interest is documented through multiple memos. In June 1945, he sent directive to the NKVD's Berlin chief asking for status updates. In August, he requested explanation for why Müller remained unlocated when other senior Nazis had been found. In October, he ordered expanded search, including investigation of possible escape routes to Western zones or neutral countries. Berier's persistence suggests not just bureaucratic thoroughness, but genuine strategic interest. The historical context explains why. By late 1945, the Cold War was beginning, and Soviet-Western Allied cooperation was fraying. Information about Western intelligence networks, which Müller possessed, was becoming increasingly valuable. Finding Müller would provide intelligence advantage in the emerging conflict. The mysterious redactions begin appearing in documents from late 1945 and early 1946. Reports that start with phrases like new information regarding subject or interrogation of source with knowledge of subjects. Movements are blacked out. Sometimes entire documents are redacted, except for classification markings and date stamps. The pattern suggests the NKVD discovered something information considered too sensitive to reveal even after the Soviet Union's collapse. Several explanations are possible. First, the NKVD found Müller, and the redactions hide this fact. Second, the NKVD turned a senior Nazi official who provided information about Müller, and revealing this source would be embarrassing. Third, the information concerned Soviet intelligence operations or methods that remain classified for unrelated reasons. Fourth, the redactions are bureaucratic overcaution, protecting information that no longer requires protection. A tantalizing reference appears in a 1953 document discussing KGB interrogation training. The document, mostly unredacted, describes a curriculum that includes consultation with experienced interrogators and mentions Source M, German specialist, among consultants who provided input to training protocols. No further identification is given. Source M could be anyone, former Wehrmacht officer, captured German intelligence official, or simple coincidence of initial. But, combined with the Müller investigation files, the reference sparks speculation. Could Müller have survived, been captured by Soviets, and worked as intelligence consultant in exchange for immunity? The speculation requires believing the Soviets would protect a Holocaust perpetrator for intelligence value, which contradicts their public position but aligns with intelligence agencies' historical willingness to prioritize operational advantage over justice. The comparison with Soviet handling of other captured Nazis provides some context. The Soviets captured thousands of German military officers, scientists, and officials. Many were tried and executed publicly. Some were used for propaganda purposes, but some, particularly those with useful technical knowledge, were put to work in Soviet facilities under close supervision, their existence not publicized. German scientists worked on Soviet weapons programs. German engineers helped rebuild Soviet infrastructure. The precedent exists for using German expertise despite war crimes. Intelligence expertise, particularly Müller's deep knowledge of Western networks and methods, would be valuable enough to potentially justify protection. But Müller's direct role in the Holocaust makes this scenario particularly disturbing and politically sensitive even decades later, explaining possible continued classification. Researchers who've examined the Soviet Müller files note strange chronological gaps. Documents from May through December 1945 are relatively complete, showing intensive search. Documents from 1946 are sparse, only occasional follow-up reports on failed leads. Then the file jumps to 1948, with documents about investigating reported sightings in West Germany and Austria. The 1947 gap is unexplained. Standard archival practice would include notation if documents were destroyed or transferred, but no such notation exists. The gap suggests either nothing happened regarding Müller in 1947, or something happened that remains classified, or documents were removed from the file without proper procedure. Each explanation has implications for understanding Müller's fate. East German Stasi files, opened after reunification, contain their own Müller investigation materials. The Stasi, created in 1950 with extensive KGB involvement and training, apparently received orders to continue searching for former Nazis, including Müller. Their files from the 1950s and 60s document hundreds of investigated sightings across East Germany, all producing negative results. But the Stasi files reference KGB information about Müller that should exist in Soviet archives, but cannot be found in declassified collections. Specifically, Stasi reports mention KGB confirmation that subject not located in Soviet zone as of 1952 and KGB instruction to maintain surveillance for possible Western infiltration. These references prove the KGB maintained active interest in Müller through the early Cold War, but corresponding KGB documents are missing from available archives. Modern Russian authorities continue to classify portions of the Müller files. Requests for declassification have been denied with explanations citing state security concerns and protection of intelligence methods. The continued classification frustrates researchers but also suggests the files contain information Russia considers sensitive even now. If the files merely documented a failed search, what would require protection? The most logical explanation is that the files contain information about Soviet intelligence operations, sources, or methods that remain classified for reasons unrelated to Müller specifically. But the possibility that information about Müller's fate itself remains too sensitive to release cannot be dismissed. What could be so sensitive about a Nazi war criminal's fate that it requires classification 80 years later? Only complete declassification will answer this question, and Russia shows no inclination to provide it. The KGB files ultimately leave the mystery unsolved while deepening its complexity. They prove the Soviets desperately wanted to find Müller. They document extensive but unsuccessful searches. They contain redactions and gaps suggesting information too sensitive to reveal. They reference mysterious consultants and sources whose identity remains hidden. They establish that if anyone found Müller, it was likely the Soviets given their control of Berlin and intensity of search. But they provide no definitive proof that the NKVD succeeded. No smoking gun documents saying subject located and secured. No interrogation transcript proving Soviet possession. Historians seeking answers in the KGB files find instead more questions: why the redactions, why the gaps, why the continued classification, and what information lies beneath the black bars, obscuring pages of documents. The Moscow ghost theory remains plausible but unproven, supported by absence of evidence that itself seems suspicious, but may simply reflect bureaucratic overclassification and the ordinary gaps in even well-maintained archives. Until Russia releases the classified portions, if ever, the question of whether Heinrich Müller died in Berlin or ended his days as an unwilling Soviet asset remains historical speculation rather than established fact. December 3rd, 1952, CIA headquarters, Washington, D.C. CIA analyst William Morgan closes the file on Heinrich Müller and writes his assessment for senior leadership. After 7 years of investigation by multiple Allied intelligence services, including approximately 250 man-hours of CIA resources devoted specifically to the Müller case, the agency concludes with moderate confidence that subject died in Berlin during May 1945. No credible evidence of survival has been developed. Continued active investigation is not recommended given resource constraints and diminishing probability of subject being alive. File to remain open for passive collection of any future information. Subject's intelligence value, if he survived, would have declined substantially by this point. The assessment goes into Müller's file and active CIA search effectively ends. The agency will continue following up reported sightings when they arise, but dedicated resources are redirected to finding Nazis more likely to be alive: Mengele, Eichmann, and others whose disappearances lack Berlin's chaos as explanation. For CIA, Heinrich Müller becomes a historical curiosity rather than active case, a phantom who probably died in 1945, but whose fate remains uncertain enough to prevent complete closure. Western intelligence agencies' pursuit of Heinrich Müller reveals a different set of priorities than Soviet efforts. Where the NKVD sought Müller primarily for intelligence exploitation, Western services, OSS, later CIA, British MI6, West German BND sought him partly for war crimes justice but largely to prevent Soviets from exploiting his knowledge. The concern was less about capturing Müller themselves and more about ensuring he didn't become a Soviet asset. This defensive priority shaped Western investigation methods and conclusions. By the early 1950s, Western intelligence had essentially concluded Müller was dead, making continued search wasteful. But doubts lingered, and the theoretical possibility of Soviet capture could never be entirely dismissed. American interest in Müller begins immediately after Berlin's fall. The OSS, Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to CIA, creates a list of most wanted Nazi intelligence officers, and Müller ranks near the top. The concern is straightforward. Müller interrogated dozens of captured American and British agents during the war. Some of these agents, after interrogation, were released supposedly for prisoner exchanges, but Western intelligence worried some might have been turned, forced to work as double agents in exchange for survival. If Müller survived with intact memory, he could identify these potentially compromised agents who now operated in post-war intelligence services. This counterintelligence concern made finding Müller, or at least determining his fate, a priority. The Counterintelligence Corps, CICUS, Army's counterintelligence service in occupied Germany, conducts the most thorough American investigation. Beginning in June 1945, CIC officers interview hundreds of Germans connected to the Gestapo, review captured documents, and follow up every reported sighting. They interrogate Müller's family repeatedly, searching for evidence of communication or support, suggesting he survived. They examine financial records, looking for hidden assets he might access. They coordinate with British intelligence, sharing information and dividing investigation tasks. The CIC investigation produces a massive file documenting Müller's career, operations, and last known movements, but no evidence of post-war survival. By 1947, CIC concludes that Müller most likely died in Berlin and that continued investigation offers diminishing returns. The CIA, created in 1947 from OSS's remnants, inherits the Müller investigation. Early CIA directors understand the geopolitical implications. If Müller survived and reached Soviet hands, American intelligence networks could be compromised. CIA coordinates with the Gehlen organization, Reinhard Gehlen's German intelligence network, employed by Americans for operations in Soviet-controlled territories. Gehlen, former Wehrmacht intelligence chief, knew Müller professionally and might recognize him or identify his methodology. CIA specifically asks Gehlen about Müller's fate. Gehlen's response, documented in CIA files, is unambiguous. He has no knowledge of Müller surviving, considers death in Berlin most likely, and thinks Müller would be incapable of adjusting to underground life given his institutional dependence. The assessment carries weight given Gehlen's professional knowledge. A 1948 CIA assessment examines the Soviet capture scenario systematically. The analysis acknowledges Soviet motivation to capture Müller and their control of Berlin provided opportunity. But the assessment argues against Soviet success based on several factors. First, the Soviets publicized other major captures for propaganda value. Why remain silent about Müller? Second, no defector from Soviet services ever reported knowing about Müller's capture despite multiple opportunities. Third, if Müller were providing intelligence to Soviets, Western services would likely detect operational patterns indicating his knowledge being exploited. The absence of such indicators suggests either Müller died or any information he provided wasn't being actively used. The assessment concludes low probability of Soviet capture, but can't entirely exclude the possibility. The Eichmann capture in 1960 prompts CIA to review the Müller case. Eichmann's interrogation by Israeli authorities includes questions about Müller's fate. CIA receives transcripts of Eichmann's testimony. Eichmann claims he last saw Müller in April 1945 in the bunker complex and has no knowledge of what happened afterward. He speculates Müller probably committed suicide, saying he was too smart to let himself be captured and too German to run. The testimony is documented in CIA files with assessments that Eichmann appeared genuinely ignorant of Müller's fate. If Eichmann, who knew Müller well and was himself a fugitive for 15 years, had no information about Müller's survival. This argues strongly for death in Berlin. CIA declassification in 1981 releases portions of the Müller file to researchers. The documents show systematic investigation through the late 1940s, declining interest in the 1950s, and eventual passive status. But significant sections remain redacted even in the 1981 release. The classification markings indicate the redactions protect sources and methods rather than information about Müller specifically. Analysts explained that investigation of Müller necessarily involves sensitive intelligence operations, surveillance of German exile communities, interrogation of prisoners using classified techniques, information from confidential sources who might still be alive. The redactions protect these operational details rather than hiding some dramatic revelation about Müller's fate. But researchers can't verify this explanation without access to the redacted material. The question of whether Western intelligence actually wanted to find Müller became controversial among historians. Some argue that having Müller captured and tried would risk revelations about Allied intelligence failures, the networks he penetrated, the agents he broke, the operations he compromised. From this perspective, Western services preferred Müller remain missing rather than face public trial that might expose embarrassing truths. The evidence for this interpretation is thin but suggestive. Western intelligence certainly had motivation to avoid public airing of wartime failures. But CIA and BND files also show genuine investigation efforts, substantial resources devoted to the search, and disappointment at failing to locate Müller. The balance of evidence suggests Western intelligence genuinely sought Müller through the late 1940s, then continued. Search was futile rather than deliberately avoiding finding him. Modern CIA statements about the Müller file are carefully worded. When asked by researchers about classified materials, agency spokespeople say that remaining redactions protect intelligence methods and the identity of confidential sources unrelated to Heinrich Müller's ultimate fate. They confirm the agency investigated Müller extensively in the first post-war decade and concluded he likely died in Berlin. They state that no evidence in CIA files suggests Müller survived beyond 1945, but they qualify this with standard intelligence community caution. Absence of evidence in CIA files does not constitute definitive proof, merely reflects limits of information available to the agency. The statements are technically accurate but unsatisfying to anyone seeking definitive answers. The contrast between Soviet and Western intelligence files is instructive. Soviet files show intensive searching well into the 1950s and contain mysterious redactions that might hide successful capture. Western files show thorough initial investigation, followed by declining interest and eventual conclusion that Müller died. Soviet files suggest an agency that might have found Müller and hidden the fact. Western files suggest agencies that failed to find Müller and eventually accepted this outcome. The contradiction might indicate Soviets succeeded where Western services failed. Or it might simply reflect different archival practices, different reasons for classification, and the ordinary gaps in historical records. Without access to complete Soviet and Western files, historians cannot resolve this contradiction. The CIA's phantom Heinrich Müller as theoretical threat who might have survived to compromise Western intelligence shaped Cold War counterintelligence practices. The possibility, however remote, that Müller provided information to Soviets meant that any wartime agent he interrogated came under suspicion. Some Allied personnel who survived Gestapo interrogation faced difficult questions after the war. What did you tell them? How did you survive when others died? Could you have been turned? These suspicions, often baseless, damaged careers and lives. The ghost of Heinrich Müller cast a shadow over Cold War intelligence, regardless of whether he actually survived. His potential survival as Soviet asset was almost as damaging as actual survival would have been, creating doubt and suspicion that served Soviet interests, even if they never captured him. The phantom was useful even as illusion, and perhaps that's the final irony. Heinrich Müller, who built his career on creating fear disproportionate to actual capacity, might have achieved his greatest effect through simple absence, the fear of what he might reveal if he survived, proving more powerful than any intelligence he could actually have provided. April 19th, 2013, Berlin. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Klaus Wagner carefully excavates the grave marked Heinrich Müller in the Jewish cemetery, working with the precision required for potential criminal evidence, despite the burial being 68 years old. Television cameras record the exhumation. The German government has agreed to allow media documentation, understanding public interest in finally solving the mystery. Wagner's team removes soil gradually, exposing a simple wooden coffin in advanced decay. The skeleton inside is mostly intact, laid out in standard burial position. Wagner photographs everything systematically before allowing removal to the laboratory. The bones will undergo comprehensive forensic analysis, including DNA extraction and comparison to samples from confirmed Müller descendants. This is the third time this grave has attracted official attention, first discovered in the 1950s, exhumed in 1963 with inconclusive results, and now exhumed again with modern genetic technology that should provide definitive answers. After 2 months of laboratory work, the results come back unambiguous. The body is not Heinrich Müller. DNA testing excludes any familial relationship to known Müller descendants. The mystery, rather than being solved, deepens. If this isn't Müller, whose body lies in the grave marked with his name, the story of the wrong body spans 7 decades and reveals how historical mysteries can generate their own false leads, red herrings that complicate rather than clarify investigations. The grave marked Heinrich Müller, born 1900, died May 1945 in Berlin's Jewish cemetery, has been the most tangible piece of evidence suggesting Müller died in Berlin. Its discovery in the 1950s gave investigators hope for simple resolution. Müller died in the chaos, was buried hastily, and lies in this identified grave. The 1963 exhumation provided inconclusive results, but didn't definitively exclude the identification. For 50 years, the grave remained a possible answer. The 2013 DNA exclusion eliminated this possibility entirely, forcing investigators to confront uncomfortable questions about how a wrong body ended up in a grave bearing one of history's most wanted men's names. The cemetery records from May 1945 are fragmentary and unreliable, reflecting the chaotic conditions under which burials occurred. The Jewish cemetery, ironically, became one of several locations where Berlin's final battle victims were buried en masse. The cemetery workers in May 1945 were themselves traumatized survivors working under Soviet military supervision, dealing with hundreds of bodies in various states of decomposition. Record keeping was minimal, often just a ledger with dates, approximate ages, and names if anyone knew them. The Heinrich Müller entry gives birth, year as 1900, death approximately May 1st, or 2nd 1945, and location found as near government quarter. The handwriting is hurried, and subsequent damage to the ledger makes some entries illegible. The 1963 exhumation, conducted with the forensic technology available at the time, produced maddeningly ambiguous results. Forensic anthropologists estimated the deceased's age at death as 45 to 55 years based on skeletal development and dental wear. Heinrich Müller would have been 63 in May 1945. The discrepancy was significant but not impossible. Age estimation from skeletal remains in 1963 had error ranges of plus or minus 10 to 15 years. The height estimation was approximately 170 centimeters, 5 feet 7 inches, matching Müller's recorded height within measurement error. The skull showed no obvious cause of death, no bullet wounds or fracture patterns indicating violence. The teeth were in poor condition, several missing, others showing advanced decay typical of wartime Germany's nutritional deficiencies. Without dental records for comparison, Müller's Gestapo personnel file apparently didn't include dental charts. Definitive identification proved impossible. Forensic analysis in 1963 noted several features that seemed inconsistent with Müller but weren't exclusionary. The bone density suggested heavy physical labour during the person's life, while Müller's career was primarily sedentary. The wear patterns on joints suggested someone who worked physically, not behind a desk. The hands, one of few areas where specific conclusions were possible, showed bone development consistent with manual labour rather than clerical work. These inconsistencies led investigators to suspect the body might not be Müller, but without DNA technology, they couldn't exclude the possibility of individual variation or errors in forensic estimation. The 1963 investigation concluded, identity cannot be confirmed. Probability that remains are Heinrich Müller, estimated at 20 to 30%. Recommend case remain open. The mystery of how a wrong body ended up marked with Müller's name has several possible explanations, none entirely satisfying. First, pure coincidence. Heinrich Müller was an extremely common name in Germany, and another Heinrich Müller born in 1900 could have died in Berlin in May 1945. The cemetery worker, knowing the name and approximate birth year, marked the grave accordingly, without realizing this, identified a war criminal. Statistical analysis suggests that in a city of 2 million people, having multiple Heinrich Müllers born in 1900 is virtually certain. Several dozen men with that exact name likely lived in Berlin, and some probably died in the final battle. Second, deliberate misdirection. Someone in 1945, knowing the Gestapo chief had disappeared intentionally, marked an unidentified body with his name to create a false trail. This would require relatively sophisticated thinking during chaotic times and assume someone had both opportunity and motivation to create such deception. If Müller had accomplices helping him disappear, they might have marked a random body with his name to make searchers think he died and stop looking. But this theory requires premeditation and coordination that seems unlikely given the circumstances. Third, cemetery worker error. Multiple bodies arrived for burial simultaneously, documentation was confused, and a cemetery worker accidentally marked the wrong grave with the name Heinrich Müller from paperwork that actually referred to a different body. This explanation assumes bureaucratic error rather than conspiracy or coincidence. The DNA analysis in 2013 provided the first absolutely definitive evidence about this grave. Whoever is buried there is not Heinrich Müller. The testing used mitochondrial DNA, which passes unchanged through maternal lines and can survive better in old bones than nuclear DNA. Scientists extracted DNA from the skeletal remains and compared it to samples from Müller's daughter and other confirmed descendants. The results showed no genetic relationship. The exclusion was absolute. This body could not possibly be Heinrich Müller or any maternal relative. Modern forensic genetics also allowed more accurate assessment of the deceased's actual identity. Analysis suggested the person was likely between 45 and 50 years old at death, worked in physically demanding occupation, and showed evidence of multiple healed fractures consistent with industrial or construction work. The profile matched a cemetery worker or labourer, not a senior SS officer. The reaction to the DNA exclusion was mixed. Some historians felt relief, finally, definitive evidence eliminating one possibility. Others felt frustration, the most tangible lead proving false deepened rather than resolved the mystery. Media coverage focused on the dramatic angle. After nearly 70 years, science proved the grave didn't contain the Gestapo chief it supposedly held for decades. But the more important implication went undercovered. If this marked grave contains the wrong person, what does that suggest about Müller's actual fate? The DNA exclusion strengthened two competing theories. It supported the death in Berlin theory by confirming that bureaucratic chaos and identification errors were common, suggesting Müller's body could lie in any unmarked grave. But it also supported the escape theory by showing that evidence supposedly confirming death in Berlin proved false, meaning no solid proof of death actually exists. The question of who actually lies in the grave marked Heinrich Müller remained partially unanswered even after DNA testing. The person was male, middle-aged, physically active, died around May 1st or 2nd, 1945, near the government quarter. He was probably German, possibly a cemetery worker or building labourer. He died during Berlin's final days, possibly from artillery, possibly from violence, possibly from one of the many causes of death during that chaotic week. Someone knew him well enough to bury him with at least a name, though whether Heinrich Müller was actually his name or a documentation error remains unknown. He became a historical footnote, his actual identity lost, remembered only as the wrong body in the grave that supposedly held a war criminal. It's a minor tragedy in the context of World War II's millions of dead, one unidentified person among thousands, but it illustrates how war's chaos destroys not just lives, but identities, leaving questions that even modern science can only partially answer. The wrong body ultimately serves as metaphor for the entire Müller investigation. Seemingly solid evidence proving false, apparent answers revealing only new questions, and the man himself remaining as elusive in death as he was invisible in life. The grave that should have provided closure instead provided frustration. The forensic science that should have confirmed identity instead confirmed its absence. Heinrich Müller, who made thousands disappear without trace, achieved for himself the same complete erasure of identity he inflicted on his victims. The marked grave stands empty of meaning, containing someone who isn't Heinrich Müller, marked with a name that leads nowhere. A monument to historical uncertainty and the limits of investigation when confronting someone who understood how to disappear. The wrong body lies in the ground. And Heinrich Müller, whether dead in an unmarked grave, escaped to unknown refuge, or captured into secret service, remains as absent from history as the day he walked away from the bunker complex and vanished into Berlin's ruins. March 21st, 2015, Berlin. Digital archivist Dr. Sarah Klein types Heinrich Müller into the newly completed database of digitized World War II documents and presses enter. The system, completed after 5 years of scanning and optical character recognition work, contains approximately 12 million documents from German, Soviet, American, and British archives. The search returns 73,421 documents containing Müller's name. Klein begins the enormous task of reviewing them systematically, looking for anything that might have been missed in previous analog searches, an overlooked reference, a misfilled report, a document that mentioned Müller peripherally and was therefore never included in targeted investigation. Modern technology allows searches previous generations couldn't conduct. But after 3 months of work, Klein's conclusion mirrors every previous investigation. Thousands of documents proving what Müller did until April 29th, 1945. And then nothing. The digital archives, for all their sophistication, contain the same endpoint as paper files. Comprehensive documentation followed by complete absence. Technology has made searching easier, but hasn't made Heinrich Müller any less vanished. The modern hunt for Heinrich Müller employs tools and methodologies unavailable to earlier investigators: digital archives, DNA analysis, satellite imagery, artificial intelligence-assisted document analysis, and crowdsourced research. These technologies have solved other historical mysteries, identified remains, traced escape routes, and filled gaps in the record. Their application to Müller's case demonstrates both the power of modern investigative techniques and their limitations when confronting someone whose disappearance may have been too complete or too long ago for even advanced technology to solve. The past decade has seen renewed investigation using these methods, producing more information about Müller's career, but no breakthrough regarding his ultimate fate. The digitization of World War II archives represents the most significant advancement in Müller research. Previously, researchers needed to physically visit archives in multiple countries, request specific documents, and manually search through files. The process was time-consuming and necessarily incomplete. No single researcher could review millions of documents. Digital archives solve this problem, allowing keyword searches across vast collections. Project led by German, Israeli, American, and Russian institutions have scanned and indexed tens of millions of wartime documents. Researchers can now search for Müller references across these collections simultaneously, but the results confirm rather than contradict previous findings. Müller's documented activities end April 29, 1945. No post-war document recovered from any archive mentions seeing him, capturing him, or interacting with him. DNA technology offers potential breakthrough if Müller's remains can be located. Modern forensic genetics can extract and analyze DNA from bones buried for 8 decades. The 2013 testing of the wrong body proved this capability. The challenge is finding remains to test. Berlin contains numerous mass graves from the 1945 battle, and individual graves marked only as unidentified male approximate age. In theory, systematic DNA testing of all such remains could identify Müller if he's buried in Berlin. In practice, this faces enormous obstacles. The cost would be millions of euros. Many families oppose exhumation of relatives on ethical and religious grounds. The bureaucratic and legal permissions required are staggering. And success requires that Müller is actually buried in a recoverable location, not destroyed in a building collapse or lost in the Spree River or one of countless other unrecoverable situations. A 2015 project used satellite archaeology techniques to map Berlin's 1945 mass grave sites. The researchers used historical aerial photographs, Soviet military maps, and modern ground-penetrating radar to identify approximately 40 locations containing large numbers of buried remains. Several of these sites were previously unknown or had been forgotten over 70 years of urban development. The project created detailed maps showing where bodies were buried during the chaos of May 1945. The research is valuable for historical understanding and potentially for future investigation. But excavating these sites faces the same obstacles as testing known graves, cost permissions, ethical concerns. The mass graves likely contain Müller if he died in Berlin, but finding one specific person among thousands of remains approaches impossibility without targeted reason to search specific locations. Artificial intelligence document analysis represents cutting-edge application to historical research. Machine learning algorithms can read documents in multiple languages, identify patterns humans might miss, and cross-reference information across vast databases. A 2018 project applied AI to analyze all known documents bearing Müller's signature, looking for patterns in the documents he prioritized, correspondence networks, and changes in behavior during his final months. The AI identified that Müller's document production dropped sharply in April 1945. Understandable, given the war's end, but also that he signed unusually high numbers of intelligence preservation orders in March and April. The AI flagged these as statistically anomalous, supporting the theory that Müller was preparing for some post-Reich scenario. But the AI couldn't penetrate beyond documented evidence to determine what happened after April 29th. Facial recognition technology applied to historical photographs offers another modern tool. Only 3 confirmed photographs of Heinrich Müller exist, remarkable for someone so senior in the Nazi hierarchy. He avoided cameras deliberately, understanding that anonymity served his operational security. But thousands of photographs from April and May 1945 show crowds of German soldiers, refugees, and displaced persons. In theory, Müller could be in one of these photographs without having been identified. A 2020 project used AI facial recognition to scan through approximately 50,000 photographs from Berlin in May 1945, looking for anyone matching Müller's facial structure. The project identified dozens of men who might be Müller based on facial geometry. Human researchers examined each candidate. None proved convincing, wrong age, wrong build, or photograph quality too poor for confidence. The technology demonstrated what's possible but couldn't definitively identify Müller in any post-April photograph. Crowdsourced research through internet platforms has engaged thousands of amateur historians in the hunt for Müller. Online forums discuss theories, analyze evidence, and occasionally uncover overlooked documents. This distributed research model can be powerful. Thousands of people examining evidence from different perspectives, sometimes spot patterns experts miss. The Müller case has active online research communities that have made genuine contributions. Locating obscure witness testimonies, finding family members willing to provide DNA samples, identifying errors in previous investigations. But crowdsourced research also produces overwhelming amounts of speculation, false leads, and conspiracy theories that add noise rather than signal. Separating useful contributions from unhelpful speculation requires expert filtering, reducing the efficiency gains from crowd participation. Genealogical DNA databases like Ancestry and 23andMe offer an unexpected tool for potentially finding escaped Nazis or their descendants. If Müller escaped and had children post-war, those descendants might appear in these databases. The Müller children in Germany could theoretically be compared against database entries to find unexpected genetic relatives. This methodology helped identify the Golden State Killer and other criminal cases. But application to Müller faces problems. His confirmed children have largely refused to participate in research. DNA database companies generally don't allow access for historical investigations without specific legal authority. And the methodology only works if Müller had post-war descendants who happen to have submitted DNA to these databases, multiple unlikely conditions that reduce probability of success. The limitations of modern technology in solving Müller's disappearance are instructive. Technology excels at processing existing evidence, finding patterns in data, and analyzing physical remains when available. But it can't create evidence where none exists. No amount of sophisticated analysis can find documents that don't exist, identify photographs that were never taken, or locate remains that cannot be found. The Müller case may simply lack the physical evidence necessary for technological solution. If he died in Berlin and his body was destroyed in rubble, no DNA technology will find him. If he escaped using false identity that left no documentary trail, no archive digitization will reveal it. If he was captured by intelligence services that successfully hid all records, no AI analysis will uncover classified documents researchers can't access. The modern hunt has, however, definitively excluded several possibilities. DNA testing proved the marked grave doesn't contain Müller. Digital archive searches confirmed no overlooked documents in accessible collections reference post-war Müller sightings. Systematic investigation of rat-line escape routes found no evidence of Müller using these networks. Genealogical research documented all known Müller descendants and confirmed none have mysterious relatives, suggesting unknown post-war children. Satellite archaeology mapped potential burial sites but found no specific reason to believe Müller is at any particular location. These are negative results, but valuable. They narrow the range of possibilities and increase confidence that positive evidence, if it exists, lies in inaccessible archives or unrecoverable physical evidence. The next generation of technology may offer new possibilities. Quantum computing could accelerate document analysis exponentially. More sophisticated AI might detect patterns in evidence too subtle for human cognition. Advances in ancient DNA extraction might allow testing of remains previously thought too degraded for analysis. Ground-penetrating radar technology improves constantly, potentially allowing more precise location of burial sites without excavation. But these future technologies face the same fundamental limitation. They require evidence to analyze. Technology can process information brilliantly but cannot create information that doesn't exist. If the truth about Heinrich Müller's fate lies in documents that no longer exist, memories that died with witnesses, or remains that are unrecoverable, then no technology, however advanced, will solve the mystery. The modern hunt has taught us what we can learn enormous amounts about Müller's career and life until April 29, 1945, and confronted us with what may be unknowable. What happened after that date when he walked into chaos and disappeared? Present day, Berlin Holocaust Memorial. A historian stands before a wall displaying names of Holocaust perpetrators, running her finger down the list until she finds Müller, Heinrich, Chief, Gestapo, Amt Fourth, RSHA. Status: unknown. That single word unknown carries more weight than any other entry. Hitler: confirmed suicide. Himmler: confirmed suicide. Heydrich: assassinated. Executed: suicide. One by one, the architects and implementers of genocide faced justice, death, or at minimum, historical certainty about their fate. Except Heinrich Müller, 8 decades of investigation by the most sophisticated intelligence services in the world have produced 3 plausible scenarios but no definitive conclusion. The historian considers the implications. Perhaps the mystery itself is the answer. The uncertainty, a fitting legacy for a man who spent his career making others disappear. But historical methodology demands weighing evidence and probability. 3 endings present themselves, each supported by circumstantial evidence, none by conclusive proof. The question is not which ending is possible, all 3 are, but which is most probable given what we know. Scenario 1. Death in Berlin. Heinrich Müller leaves the Führerbunker complex on the evening of April 29, 1945, wearing civilian clothes under his SS uniform. He intends to reach his family apartment in Charlottenburg, perhaps to provide final resources or simply see his wife and children one last time. Soviet forces control much of Berlin, but corridors still exist where German military and civilian movement is possible. Müller moves carefully through damaged streets, avoiding Soviet patrols, using his knowledge of the city to navigate. Near Lehrte station, approximately 2 kilometers from the bunker, Soviet artillery begins a barrage. The shelling is random, targeting suspected German positions. Müller takes cover in a damaged building. A shell strikes the structure, bringing down what remains of the upper floors. Müller dies instantly, buried under tons of rubble. Days later, Soviet or German workers clearing debris find his body crushed beyond easy identification. The civilian clothes mean no SS documentation. His face is damaged. No one recognizes him. He's buried in a mass grave with dozens of other unidentified victims, or his remains are simply left in the building as it's demolished for safety. Heinrich Müller becomes one of approximately 40,000 unidentified Berlin dead from the battle, his body never recovered or recovered but never identified. The probability assessment for Scenario 1, 60 to 70%, according to most historians who've examined the evidence. This scenario requires no elaborate planning, explains the complete absence of post-war sightings, accounts for family abandonment, and aligns with the statistical reality that tens of thousands died unidentified in Berlin's final battle. The chaos of urban warfare provides perfect conditions for anonymous death. The evidence supporting this scenario includes Müller's last known location in an active combat zone, the extraordinary number of unidentified dead from that period, the pattern of Soviet bombardment in the government quarter, the absence of any credible post-war evidence of his survival, and the professional assessment by multiple Soviet intelligence agencies that death in Berlin is most likely. The evidence against death in Berlin focuses on Müller's preparation and capabilities. The civilian clothes under uniform suggest planning for identity change rather than simply moving through the city. The selective file preservation in his final weeks indicates thinking beyond immediate survival. His intelligence training and experience would have prepared him for escape scenarios. Most troubling for the death theory, no body has ever been found. Every other senior Nazi in Berlin at the end, Hitler, Goebbels, Bormann, Krebs, was found, identified, or credibly reported dead. Only Müller vanished completely. The counter-argument is that absence of body proves nothing given the number of unrecoverable remains, but the complete absence of even rumours of his death is notable. The psychological assessment supports death in Berlin in unexpected ways. Müller was a man defined entirely by institutional role. Remove that, role destroy the Reich, eliminate the Gestapo, collapse the entire framework in which he functioned, and what remains? Perhaps nothing capable of adapting to post-war existence. Suicide or simply giving up when confronted with total institutional collapse fits his psychology. He showed no emotion throughout the final months, processed the end with same detachment as everything else, and when the moment came, perhaps he simply stopped. Not dramatic suicide like Hitler or Goering, but quiet acceptance of death when alternative required, becoming someone else entirely. Scenario 2. Soviet capture. Heinrich Müller leaves the bunker complex with specific intention: surrender to Soviet intelligence. In his final weeks, he's made contact through intermediaries, perhaps captured German officers working for NKVD, perhaps direct approach through Swiss or Swedish channels. He's offered a deal, intelligence about Western spy networks, in exchange for protection from prosecution. The Soviets, understanding his value, agree. On the night of April 29th, or morning of April 30th, Müller makes his way to a pre-arranged contact point. NKVD agents take him into custody, immediately transporting him out of Berlin to Soviet-controlled territory. The next weeks are spent in intensive debriefing names, addresses, codes, methods, everything he knows about Allied intelligence operations. The Soviets are satisfied with the value received. Müller is given new identity, relocated to Soviet Union or Soviet-occupied territory, and kept under close supervision. He lives under assumed name, possibly consulting on interrogation techniques or counterintelligence methods, until natural death sometime in the 1950s or 60s. Soviet records of this arrangement remain classified, explaining the gaps and redactions in Russian archives. The probability assessment for Scenario 2, 20 to 25%. This scenario requires believing the Soviets would grant immunity to a Holocaust architect for intelligence value, which contradicts their public position on Nazi war criminals, but aligns with intelligence agencies' historical pragmatism. The evidence supporting Soviet capture includes Berier's documented intense interest in finding Müller specifically, the mysterious redactions in Russian archives that might hide his capture, the absence of body or death confirmation despite Soviet control of Berlin, and intensive search, several defector reports claiming Müller worked for Soviets, though none definitively confirmed, and references in Soviet documents to German intelligence consultants whose identities remain hidden. The evidence against Soviet capture is substantial. No Soviet document explicitly confirms capturing Müller. No defector with direct knowledge has emerged. The Soviets publicized other major Nazi captures for propaganda value. Why maintain absolute silence about the Gestapo chief? Müller's intelligence value would have declined rapidly after 1945 as Western networks were rebuilt. The continued Russian classification of documents could reflect bureaucratic overcaution rather than hiding dramatic secrets. Most significantly, the pattern of Soviet handling of captured Nazis doesn't match what would be expected for Müller. They tried and executed senior perpetrators publicly rather than hiding them for intelligence use. The psychological assessment cuts both ways. Could Müller, who fought communists his entire career, work for Soviets? His lack of ideology suggests yes, he served whoever held power, and by May 1945, the Soviets held his life. He demonstrated consistent ability to subordinate personal beliefs to institutional survival, but could the Soviets trust him? Intelligence agencies generally prefer willing defectors to forced cooperators because loyalty under duress is unreliable. Müller would be cooperating only to avoid execution, making him potentially untrustworthy, unless the Soviets kept him so closely controlled that trustworthiness was irrelevant, essentially a prisoner who occasionally provided consultation rather than a genuine intelligence asset. Scenario 3. Escape and survival. Heinrich Müller leaves the bunker complex with carefully prepared false documentation, modest amount of portable wealth, and intelligence files that might serve as insurance. He moves through Berlin's chaos toward the Western zones, understanding that Soviet capture means interrogation and likely execution, while Western capture might offer opportunities for negotiation. Using false papers, identifying him as Hermann Fischer, a Wehrmacht clerk, he blends into millions of displaced persons and demobilized soldiers flooding across occupied Germany. He reaches American zone by late May, claiming to be a refugee from East Prussia. The Americans, overwhelmed processing millions of Germans, accept his documentation without deep investigation. Müller works menial jobs, maintains absolute operational security, forms no relationships, and lives quietly in southern Germany or Austria for several years. Eventually, he possibly relocates to South America using ratline networks, or remains in Germany under false identity. He lives anonymous existence, working ordinary jobs, until natural death sometime in the 1960s or later. His discipline and training allow him to maintain cover identity flawlessly for decades, and he takes his secret to the grave. The probability assessment for Scenario 3, 5 to 15%. This is the least probable scenario according to most historians, but cannot be entirely excluded. The evidence supporting escape includes Müller's intelligence training and understanding of how to create and maintain false identity, the preparation suggested by civilian clothes and selective file preservation, the thousands of Nazis who successfully escaped via rat lines or simply by hiding in plain sight, and the complete absence of body, or confirmed death, which could indicate successful escape rather than anonymous death. The evidence against escape is overwhelming. No credible post-war sighting has ever been confirmed despite decades of investigation by multiple intelligence services. Müller's family received no support or contact, which differs from patterns of other escaped Nazis who typically maintain some family connection. No documents suggesting Müller obtained false papers have surfaced despite extensive archive searches. His name appears on no ratline records, passenger manifests, or refugee registrations. Every investigated sighting proved false or unreliable. Most significantly, Mossad's search in South America after capturing Eichmann found no trace of Müller despite thorough investigation of German exile communities. The psychological assessment argues against successful escape. Müller's personality structure, emotionally flat, institutionally dependent, lacking social skills for building relationships, seems poorly suited for life underground, requiring improvisation and community integration. Men who successfully lived as fugitives for decades typically possessed flexibility, social intelligence, and ability to create plausible new identities. Müller's entire documented life shows someone who functioned within rigid hierarchies and defined procedures. Remove that structure, and could he adapt? The evidence suggests not. His complete lack of human attachments would prevent social mistakes that often betray fugitives, but it might also prevent him from creating functional new identity requiring normal human interaction. Weighing the evidence. The preponderance of evidence points to Scenario 1, death in Berlin, as most probable explanation. The chaos of urban warfare, the enormous number of unidentified dead, the absence of any credible post-war evidence of survival, and professional assessment by multiple intelligence agencies all support this conclusion. The alternative scenarios require believing in either remarkable Soviet secrecy maintained for 8 decades or successful escape leaving absolutely no trace despite intensive searching. Absence of confirming evidence isn't proof these scenarios are wrong, but they require more assumptions and unproven elements than the death in Berlin theory. Yet uncertainty remains inherent to this case. We lack the one piece of evidence that would provide certainty: a confirmed body. Without Müller's remains identified through DNA or other definitive means, the question stays open. The 3 scenarios aren't equally probable, but all 3 remain possible. Perhaps this uncertainty is fitting legacy for Heinrich Müller. He built a career on making people disappear, on creating absence where there should be presence, on ensuring that his victims left no trace. That he himself disappeared so completely has tragic symmetry. The bureaucrat of absence became an absence, and history confronts the same uncertainty, the same lack of closure that millions of Holocaust victims' families experienced. The difference is that those families deserved answers and justice. Müller deserves neither sympathy nor the mystery that protects his memory. But deserve and receive are different things. And 8 decades later, the question of what happened to Heinrich Müller remains, if not unanswerable, then at least unanswered. April 29th, 2025, Berlin. On the 80th anniversary of Heinrich Müller's disappearance, a small group gathers at the Holocaust Memorial for a commemoration focused not on Müller himself, but on the questions his absence raises about justice, memory and accountability. A survivor's daughter speaks. "My mother was murdered in Auschwitz on a transport approved by Heinrich Müller's signature. She has a name, a date, a place of death, documented with German efficiency. But the man who sent her there has none of these things. He is absence, ghost, eternal, question mark. There is something profoundly wrong about this asymmetry. The words hang in the cold Berlin air, crystallizing what historians and survivors have struggled to articulate for 8 decades. Heinrich Müller's disappearance is not just a historical puzzle, it's a wound in the historical record, a failure of justice, and a reminder that some perpetrators escape not just punishment but even the certainty of fate. The legacy of Heinrich Müller extends far beyond the biographical question of what happened to him personally. His career and disappearance illuminate uncomfortable truths about bureaucratic evil, the nature of accountability in industrial-scale atrocity, and how systems of terror depend on men who are willing to be invisible while enabling unthinkable crimes. Müller was not the most famous Nazi, not the most ideologically committed, not the most publicly prominent, but he was arguably the most essential, the man who made the machinery of genocide function efficiently. Understanding his significance requires grappling with what Hannah Arendt famously called the banality of evil. Though Müller represents something beyond banal, his evil was administrative, technical, and executed with competence that made him more dangerous than theatrical sadists or raging ideologues. The bureaucratic nature of Müller's crimes challenges comfortable narratives about the Holocaust. We want to believe that industrial genocide requires monsters men so obviously evil that their crimes are explicable as aberrations, extremes of human capacity. Müller was not monstrous in appearance or behaviour. He was efficient, organised, methodical, and emotionally flat. He processed murder with the same administrative competence that another person might bring to managing logistics or organising production. His crimes were committed through paperwork, signatures, administrative coordination, and systematic organisation. This is more disturbing than dramatic evil because it suggests that horrific outcomes can result from ordinary administrative processes managed by people who aren't obviously evil, just exceptionally efficient at